Hey everyone, welcome to Dark Dossier. Before we dive into the video, comment your city down below. I wanna see where you're all tuning in from. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss out. Let's get started. Story 1. The Silent Jewel Thief of 18th Century Paris. Paris, 1755. The narrow streets of Le Marais echoed with the clatter of wooden carts and murmurs of bread vendors. From the ivory balconies of the Faubourg Saint-Honoré to the candlelit salons of the bourgeois elite, jewels gleamed under candlelight like captured stars. The city, wrapped in powdered wigs and muslin ruffles, sparkled with opulence, but it was also a stage for quiet deceptions. It began quietly, as these stories often do. A string of vanishing jewels. In the spring of 1755, Madame Lenoir, the widow of a spice merchant, hosted an intimate gathering. Among those present were a retired fencing master, a local poet, and Monsieur d'Avranches, a minor noble with debts hidden beneath his powdered facade. After a game of piquet, Madame Lenoir returned to her dressing room only to find her prized sapphire ring missing from its carved ivory box. No lock had been forced. No window opened. The doors had remained watched by her two loyal servants, neither of whom had moved from their posts. The disappearance was noted but dismissed. Madame Lenoir herself suspected she may have misplaced it, but 2 weeks later the Countess du Bellay reported a stolen emerald brooch again, taken from a locked drawer in her home during an evening gathering. A week after that, a diamond earring from a marquise's estate. Quiet whispers began to circulate. There was no sign of intrusion, no forced entry, no missing servants, no broken locks. It was as if the jewels were vanishing on their own. Inspector Barthélemy enters. The responsibility for investigating the growing list of disappearances fell to Inspector Lucien Barthélemy, a stoic man in his early 40s, known for his silence and fondness for camphor-scented gloves. He wasn't among the city's most flamboyant investigators, but he was thorough. His methodical nature was viewed as boring by his superiors, but it made him a ghost in the criminal world. Forgettable, quiet, observant. Barthélemy didn't begin by questioning servants or reviewing guest lists. He walked. He studied the city not as a map, but as a system of daily rituals. He understood that to commit such thefts without disturbing a lock or alarming a dog, one would need familiarity not just with objects, but with people, their tendencies, their daily movements, their habits. He visited all 4 victims, staying no longer than 10 minutes in each home, taking no notes. In each case, he asked only one question. Did anyone arrive late to the gathering? The answer in all 4 cases was yes, but not the same person. At first glance, there was no pattern. The servant who noticed nothing. At the du Bellay estate, Barthélemy requested to speak to the chambermaid, Elise, who had been tasked with cleaning the Countess's quarters after the party. "Did you find the drawer disturbed?" he asked. Elise shook her head. "No, monsieur, it was precisely as she left it." Barthélemy pressed further. "Were any items in the room misplaced? Any candles used? Wax dripped?" Elise hesitated. "There was one candle, the one nearest the drawer. It was melted more than the others, though I lit them all at the same time." Barthélemy merely nodded. Later, at the Lenoir home, a similar detail emerged. One candle closer to the stolen object was melted far more than the rest. Theories and quiet accusations. Rumors of a servant network began to spread. Surely, a coordinated effort between footmen, chambermaids, and butlers could allow for such seamless theft. The idea thrilled the press, though it horrified the nobility. Barthélemy, however, had another theory. He consulted old records of similar unsolved thefts and found a chilling note from a case in 1747. No forced entry, nothing broken. The candle had been tampered with. The suspect vanished. He visited a former locksmith who had once worked for the royal household. "If one wished to make a drawer seem locked," Barthélemy asked, "without actually securing it, how might they do it?" The old man laughed. A decoy, a lock played over an empty notch. It appears sealed, but it's only for show. Most nobles never actually test their own locks. Bartholomew's silence deepened. He was starting to see a pattern. The man with no real name. In late June, a footman named Henry reported seeing a stranger leaving the Marquise d'Angen's dressing room on the night of a disappearance. The man had been dressed like a servant but carried himself with the poise of someone far more educated. When asked to describe him, Henry said, "He had no scent. Most men smell of powder or wine. He was like a candle just blown out." This detail, strange as it was, struck Bartholomew. A man who moved without scent, who entered homes disguised, and knew the habits of the upper class. This was no common thief. He wasn't merely stealing jewels. He was studying them. A connection to the theater. Bartholomew expanded his search to include theater registries and costuming shops. He reasoned that someone skilled in disguise, able to blend into both salons and sculleries, would need materials and perhaps training. At a small costume rental shop near the Seine, the owner spoke of a man who rented garments every other week. He never used a name, the tailor said, paid in coin, requested footman's garb, then a clergyman's robe, once even an undertaker's coat. I assumed he was a playwright. The tailor showed Bartholomew the ledger. There were no names, just sketches of what the man had requested. One sketch showed a valet uniform. Another, a powdered wig in the Du Bellay family style. Bartholomew took the page without a word. The tailor never saw the quiet inspector again. The empty room at the inn. In early August, a tiny inn near the city outskirts reported an unpaid room rental. The guest had paid for 2 weeks but left after only 5 nights. The room contained no belongings, only candle wax pooled near a cracked window, and a smudged sketch of a diamond brooch that matched the one reported missing from the Marquise. The guest's name had not been provided, but the innkeeper remembered a peculiar habit. He carried gloves, always, even in the heat, never removed them. Bartholomew visited the room and stayed in silence for several minutes, watching how the light struck the walls. Then he removed one of his own gloves and pressed his bare hand to the windowsill. Warm, faintly sticky. He examined the wax. Orange blossom scent. Unusual. Candles in Paris were made with beeswax or tallow. Only imported candles, typically from Florence, used orange blossom. Luxury disguised in subtlety. A city unaware. Weeks passed. The thefts slowed, but they didn't stop. One final case struck in early September, an heirloom stolen from a widow on Rue Saint-Anne. This time, however, a neighbor glimpsed someone leaving the residence just before midnight. "He moved like a dancer," the witness said, "quick but quiet. I only saw him for a moment." Bartholomew now had 2 sketches, 4 matching patterns, and several threads leading toward a single truth. This was the work of one man. A man who lived in disguise, who knew locks and candles, who never stayed in one place. A man so careful, even his scent was hidden. But the question remained: how was he gaining access to rooms without alerting guards or animals? And more curiously, why hadn't he sold a single stolen gem? All records, including those from black market informants and pawnbrokers, showed no sign of the missing jewels being traded. They were simply gone. By mid-September 1755, Inspector Lucien Bartholomew sat in his narrow office above the stables of the Châtelet. His desk was unadorned, save for a candle stub and a folded map of Paris. His reports on the thefts were written with meticulous clarity, but what stood out was what he didn't write. He rarely speculated on motive. He never dramatized behavior. He simply described patterns. And within these patterns, a shadow moved, never violent, never noisy, but always exacting. Bartholomew believed he was close. But as the city prepared for the autumn festival of St. Michel, the jewel thief vanished again. Or rather, he returned, but changed his rhythm. A crime in reverse. It happened at the Hôtel de Saint-Gervais. Madame Bessières, a well-known patron of artists, discovered a pearl necklace in her dressing drawer one she hadn't seen in 15 years. It had gone missing during a move, presumed lost to rats or poor packing. She had never reported it stolen. But now, polished and complete, it rested in the very place her new sapphire pendant had been the night before. The pendant, naturally, was gone. Barthélemy was called at once. The swap was precise, identical drawer placement, same angle of drape across the velvet lining. It was as if the thief was mocking them. More than that, he seemed to be communicating. Barthélemy leaned over the necklace. No fingerprints, of course, but the faint scent of orange blossom was there again, delicate, ghost-like. This wasn't just a criminal, this was a curator. Into the archives. Unable to determine the man's present, Barthélemy dove into the past. He scoured court records and estate inventories, hunting for references to unsolved thefts with similar details: wax drips, unused locks, absent servants. He cross-referenced these with costume shop receipts, wax suppliers, and rumors from the city's taverns and stagehouses. Finally, he found something. A sealed report dated 1741, filed under a pseudonym and marked archival only. The details matched precisely. A string of thefts in Bourg's jewels vanished from private homes during dinners, all within a 6-month period. One item, a gold ring with the initials EV, was reportedly replaced in a drawer 5 months later. The case had been quietly buried. The officer in charge, a young lieutenant named Barthélemy. He had chased the thief once before. The gentleman collector. The deeper Barthélemy searched, the more he realized the thief had likely been operating for at least 20 years, always in short bursts, appearing in one city, committing 5 to 10 thefts over 6 months, and disappearing again. The targets were always high society. The methods always surgical. But what puzzled Barthélemy most was what was stolen. These were not the most valuable items in the home. In fact, in most cases, the thief had bypassed objects of obvious worth in favor of items with sentimental or symbolic value: a brooch given at a wedding, a pendant once owned by a grandmother. Why? A theory emerged. This man wasn't stealing for money. He was building something. A private collection, perhaps. A secret archive of stories and memories, accessible only to himself. A curator of stolen time. Disguises within disguises. In October, Barthélemy received a tip from a costume maker in Montmartre. A man had recently requested a livery uniform from a house that had not existed for decades. When pressed, the man said he was portraying a historical figure for a private gathering. The order had been paid in advance, with an Italian coin no longer in circulation. The sketch provided matched those from the previous tailor: medium build, narrow face, dark eyes, quiet posture. The man had no accent. He spoke as a Parisian, but with a vocabulary so neutral it bordered on theatrical. Barthélemy now suspected the thief's disguises weren't just physical, they were linguistic. He altered his mannerisms, his scent, his gait, even the cadence of his speech. He might have dined with his victims and been forgotten an hour later. So Barthélemy devised a trap. The salon at Saint-Eustache. Barthélemy arranged for a false soirée hosted by a friend of the prefecture. The setting: a small salon near Saint-Eustache. Invitations were sent to known socialites, along with discreet rumors that several rare diamonds would be displayed during the gathering. The idea was simple: bait. The diamonds were false but passable. The guest list was pre-vetted. A small team of undercover guards posed as servants. Every drawer was lined with powder to detect fingerprints. Wax was tested for scent. They waited. The evening passed without incident. No guests appeared out of place. No items were taken. But the next morning, when the room was checked, One of the false diamonds was missing, replaced with a tiny, folded note. The original cut was finer, regards. The note was unsigned, but perfumed faintly with orange blossom. A visit to the night markets. Frustrated, Bartholomew turned to less official means. He made contact with a man known only as Muron, a fence for rare items and collector of gossip. Muron claimed he had heard of the thief, though not by name. "They call him Le Passant, the passerby," Muron said, smiling with 3 teeth. "He never sells, never buys, he collects, quietly, and he returns what no longer pleases him." Bartholomew asked, "What does he look like?" "Like you," Muron shrugged, "but shorter and forgettable." Then he paused. "Except for one thing, he hums, only briefly, a low melody, a few notes, just before the theft, like a ritual." Bartholomew took note. It wasn't much, but it was something human. A melody. The apprentice who noticed everything. A week later, Bartholomew received a letter from a young apprentice locksmith named Jules, who claimed to have seen a man fitting Le Passant's description in the early hours outside a townhouse in the 6th arrondissement. "I thought he was praying," Jules wrote. "He stood perfectly still by the window, head bowed, and then he touched the shutters and moved on." Bartholomew visited the house. Nothing had been stolen. But when he tested the window, he found that the latch, though appearing sealed, was actually false. The mechanism had been tampered with to simulate closure. Inside, the family safe had been left open but untouched. The thief had been there, but he had walked away. The mind of the thief. Bartholomew now saw a chilling truth. The thief wasn't taking what he could. He was curating an experience. Each theft was a performance. The preparations and entrance as a guest or servant. The lighting, carefully placed candles. The timing, always during music or distraction. The touch, gloved, scented, precise. And then just as quietly he would leave. Never in a rush. Never caught. And sometimes he would return what he'd taken, as if to remind the victims that their memories were not their own. The memory that wouldn't die. In early November, Bartholomew's investigation reached a turning point. An elderly widow named Madame Rousseau claimed that a man had once returned a ring to her that had gone missing years before. "He left it in a book," she said, "between the pages of a devotional I hadn't touched in months." Bartholomew asked what the ring meant to her. "It was from my mother. She wore it during the plague. It was more than jewelry, it was survival. The thief had taken it, then brought it back." When asked if she remembered what the man looked like, Madame Rousseau paused. "I don't," she whispered, "but I remember humming." She hummed a phrase, low, brief, descending in tone. Bartholomew wrote it down. 3 notes. A rare music box. His final lead came from a shop that sold mechanical curiosities. The owner recalled a man buying a miniature music box 2 years prior, engraved with those same 3 notes. The shopkeeper had tuned the box himself. "I asked him if it was for a child," he said. "He smiled and said no, for entrances." Bartholomew asked if the man had left a name. "No," said the shopkeeper, "but he paid in Florence coin and tipped me with a pearl." The box, the candles, the gloves, the locks, it was all part of a design. Bartholomew finally understood. Le Passant didn't steal for need or for revenge. He did it for the art of it. Each theft was a stage. Each home a theater. Each jewel a memory borrowed and sometimes returned. But one question still remained. Where was the collection kept? If he never sold the jewels, where did they go? In the chill of late November 1755, with the smell of wood smoke thick in the alleys of Paris and frost whispering along the Seine, Inspector Lucien Bartholomew moved with the quiet intensity of a man closing in. The pieces were falling into place, not cleanly, not entirely, but enough to give shape to a shadow. He now knew what Le Passant was, a collector of sentiment, not wealth, a man whose crimes were quiet performances, but knowledge alone didn't bring justice. Bartholomew needed place. He needed a physical space, somewhere the thief returned to, somewhere the stolen objects were not just stored but arranged. And perhaps most importantly, somewhere forgotten. A walk along the river. Bartholomew returned to the riverbanks, tracing the old cobblestone paths along the Quai des Grands Augustins. This part of the city was ancient even by Parisian standards. Here, time pooled in alleys like rain in cellar grates. It was the kind of place where secrets didn't just hide, they grew moss. He had a theory. If Le Passant operated for decades, his storage had to be similarly discreet, neither in a private home nor a criminal den. It had to be somewhere between public and private, somewhere he could vanish into without arousing suspicion. He began to consider abandoned quarters, dormant properties, or forgotten rooms within larger structures, perhaps old inns, religious buildings, or repurposed guild halls. Then he remembered the sketch from the innkeeper, the room where a stolen brooch had been sketched, and wax from an orange blossom candle had pooled near a cracked window. The inn itself no longer existed, but the building still stood. And the room. It had never been rented again. A room that wasn't on the map. The inn was now part of a private residence owned by a retired merchant. Bartholomew, under the pretense of structural inspection, requested access to the attic levels. The landlord, mildly curious but compliant, allowed it. The stairwell creaked like something protesting memory. The door to the attic level was sealed with a rusted latch, not a lock. And beyond it, silence. Bartholomew stepped in slowly. There were no lanterns, only thin light filtering through warped wooden slats. Dust hung in the air like old breath. The room was modest. One chair, one writing desk, and one trunk. He approached the trunk carefully. It was unlatched. Inside, neatly arranged in velvet pouches, were 12 pieces of stolen jewelry. He knew each of them by description. The emerald brooch from the Du Bellay estate, the sapphire ring from Madame Lenoir, and others previously unlinked, long presumed lost. Each was labeled, not by value but by date and location. A handwritten note accompanied each. Returned to original drawer, too predictable. This one hummed when the light touched it. Kept for color, not size. Bartholomew exhaled slowly. This was not a thief's stash. This was an exhibit. The journal. On the desk sat a leather-bound journal, unlocked, no name on the cover. Inside were pages of observations, floor plans, and even short philosophical musings on the role of memory in possession. One line read, "To possess something is to understand it as it was, not as it is. A jewel on the neck is common. A jewel in a stranger's drawer unseen becomes a story." Bartholomew read further. One entry described the room he was standing in. "This is the only place where nothing is locked, and yet everything is safe." And then he saw it beneath a folded page, a hand-drawn map. Not of Paris, but of a network of other rooms. Dots placed in cities like Lyon, Bruges, Vienna, even Lisbon, each marked with similar notations. This wasn't a local habit. This was a lifestyle. A circuit of silence. The final candle. One item on the desk was strange. A candle half-used, wrapped in linen. Bartholomew unwrapped it. The scent was unmistakable, orange blossom. On the wax were 3 vertical scratches, almost like musical notation. He lit it. For a moment, the room was bathed in amber light. And then he heard it, barely audible, almost imagined, a humming. It wasn't coming from the candle. It was his own breath, echoing the same tune Madame Rousseau had remembered. The melody had been transferred like a virus, from mind to mind. Even Bartholomew, without meaning to, had begun to hum it. A final fingerprint. The man who wasn't there. He filed no arrest. How could he? There was no name, no identity, no living suspect. The journal made no mention of accomplices, family, or origins, only thoughts, movements, descriptions of eyes watching from behind wigs and servant uniforms. Bartholomew collected the jewels and delivered them quietly to the families from whom they had been taken. Some were grateful, others confused. One nobleman accused him of planting the stolen object as a political trap. In the end, Bartholomew stopped explaining. He simply returned what was lost. But he kept the journal and the map, the postscript. Months passed, then years. No similar crimes were reported in Paris. But Bartholomew began seeing patterns elsewhere in archives, in letters from fellow inspectors, in quiet rumors from Lyon and Vienna. A jeweler in Amsterdam reported a man requesting a custom box lined in aged velvet for items not to be worn, only remembered. The style was unmistakable. Le Passant had moved on. Still, Bartholomew returned once a year to the attic room. He never found it disturbed. But 1 year, 10 years later, he found something on the desk. A single candle, unlit, wrapped in linen, and beneath it a note. Memory cannot be locked, Inspector, only borrowed. Thank you for not slamming the door. Reflection, a crime of stillness. Bartholomew never published his findings. Not out of fear or failure, but because he came to believe Le Passant had exposed something profound, not just about crime, but about ownership itself. This was not a man who broke into homes. He entered stories, briefly, gently, and left behind mystery in place of certainty. He never harmed, never threatened. But he unsettled. Not because of what he took, but because of how quietly he returned it. Story 2. The Post Office Phantom Missing Stamps in Suburban Missouri. The year was 1978. In the quiet town of Fenton, Missouri, nestled just outside St. Louis, where backyards blended into each other and neighbors borrowed sugar without hesitation, the strangest crime in town's memory didn't begin with a scream, a break-in, or even a missing person. It began with a missing stamp. Just one, then another, and then dozens more, each vanishing from locked postal safes, private collections, and employee lockers, leaving behind no trace but growing confusion. This wasn't a heist. This was a slow leak. And it left the community rattled in ways no one expected. A hobby and a legacy. Walter Kinsey was a quiet man, 62, retired train engineer. He lived alone on the corner of Magnolia Street and had two known passions, black coffee and stamps. His home was neatly kept, his lawn cut with ruler precision, and his collection, a legacy spanning 6 decades, was considered the most valuable in Jefferson County. He wasn't wealthy, but he was respected. His stamps weren't for sale, and he rarely spoke of them. But once a year, during the Fenton Stamp Club's winter meeting, he would bring out a single binder for public view. It wasn't the rarest stamps that mattered to Walter. It was the story. Each one carried letters from soldiers, misprints from wartime shortages, rare markings from long-defunct mail routes. In January 1978, Walter brought his binder to the meeting, opened it with the usual gentle reverence, and stopped. Page 6, row 2, empty. Where there had been a blue, inverted Jenny reprint, there was only a faint imprint from where the adhesive mount had once rested. He looked again. Gone. Walter said nothing, but others in the club noticed his face tighten. An incident at the post office. The Fenton post office was a modest structure, sandwiched between a bakery and a dry cleaner. With a staff of 9 and 2 delivery vans, it was hardly a high-security institution. But a week after the Stamp Club meeting, a postal safe was found ajar. Inside were missing 2 panes of commemorative stamps, unreleased Elvis Presley sheets set to launch in March. No sign of forced entry, no broken locks, the alarm never triggered. Postmaster Lydia Carter reported it as internal error, blaming an inventory mistake. But privately, she wasn't so sure. The Elvis sheets were stored behind 2 layers of locked cabinetry. Only 3 employees had the key. And yet, no one had seen or heard anything unusual. The collectors' panic. Over the following month, local stamp collectors began reporting strange inconsistencies. A WWII Victory stamp gone from a secure firebox. A rare Columbian Exposition issue vanished during a move, despite being logged, packed, and double-checked. One man claimed his entire binder had been reordered, with 3 stamps removed and replaced with different but similar issues. The oddest part: no break-ins, no signs of theft, and in some cases, nothing else in the homes or mailrooms had been touched, just the stamps. Word spread quietly. Collectors are a detail-oriented group. They began to compare notes. And gradually, a term emerged: the phantom. Inspector Gene Rutherford takes the case. When the missing Elvis stamp sheets reached the ears of the USPS's inspection service, a man named Gene Rutherford was dispatched from St. Louis. At 47, he was known more for his work in mail fraud than burglary. But he had a reputation: calm, sharp, and obsessively procedural. Rutherford didn't start with interviews. He started with patterns. He mapped every known disappearance across Fenton and nearby towns. Nearly all occurred within a 5-mile radius. And within that radius, a postal route. Just one. Assigned to a man named Earl Summers, age 34. Quiet, punctual, never missed a day of work, and, as Rutherford discovered quickly, a stamp collector himself. The problem with Earl. On paper, Earl was ordinary. He lived in a 2-bedroom duplex with his mother, had never married, worked the same route for 9 years. No complaints, no citations, wore clean uniforms, and never sped the postal van. But Rutherford found something odd during their first conversation. When asked about the missing Elvis sheets, Earl smiled, not suspiciously but almost wistfully. "They'll be worth something someday," he said. "Some things you just know." Rutherford took note. He began reviewing Earl's postal logs. Nothing unusual until a pattern emerged. Earl often swapped delivery times, sometimes delivering to the end of the route hours earlier than scheduled, and then circling back. When asked why, he shrugged. Weather dogs customers. But the weather had been fine, and none of the customers remembered any dogs. The locked room problem. By March, the case reached a curious deadlock. More items had vanished, always stamps, never other valuables. In one case, a stamp was removed from a framed display, the glass untouched. In another, a stamp previously lost was returned, placed in the wrong binder, facing the wrong way. The phantom was not just stealing, he was reorganizing. At first, Rutherford assumed it was psychological, a need for control, a kind of compulsion. But when he returned to speak with Walter Kinsey again, the old man said something that stopped him cold. "I don't think he's a thief," Walter said quietly, eyes never leaving his stamps. "I think he's a curator." A visit to the basement. Rutherford got a warrant. Not for arrest, but for search. He arrived at Earl's duplex unannounced, accompanied by a local sheriff. The house was tidy. Earl's mother, Judith, offered tea. She seemed unaware of the reason for their visit. Rutherford, careful with his tone, asked Earl to show them the basement. Earl didn't hesitate. The basement was dry, cement-floored, with a single overhead bulb. At first glance, ordinary. But then Rutherford saw it. A filing cabinet. Not locked. Inside were dozens of binders, each labeled not by country or theme, but by location and person. Kinsey, 1952, 1965. Fenton Poe misfiles. Donated unverified origins. Returned not accepted. Each binder contained stamps, some clearly marked USPS property, others long missing local items. And every stamp was cataloged by type, condition, and estimated date of original loss. Some were mounted with gloves, others in sleeves. One sheet had a handwritten note. Elvis II missing from original, rest intact, better preserved than postal archive. No money changed hands. There was no evidence Earl sold the stamps, no black market connections, no offshore transfers, no debts, no hidden funds. He hadn't profited from any of it. When questioned, Earl didn't deny anything. "I didn't take them," he said. "I saved them. They were going to rot. People lose things, I don't." "Why return some?" Rutherford asked. "Because they were ready," Earl said simply. "Because they weren't mine." He never showed anger. Only a quiet belief that what he'd done was necessary. Charges and closure. The USPS recovered 212 missing stamps, including the Elvis sheets, the inverted Jenny reprint, and several privately owned collector items. Some were returned. Others couldn't be legally traced. Rutherford recommended leniency, no profit, no violence, no break-ins, just quiet intrusion and an archive of obsessive detail. Earl was charged with unauthorized possession of government property, but served only 9 months of probation. He left Postal Service the next year and disappeared. Echoes in the collection world. For years afterward, collectors in the Midwest shared a rumor. Sometimes, a missing stamp would reappear returned by mail, in a nondescript envelope with a small note. "Now it belongs to you again." It was always typed, always unsigned. The envelopes bore no fingerprints. And always, the return address was blank. Reflection: what belongs to us? The Phantom never broke a lock, never made a scene. But he unsettled the town, just the same, by reminding people how fragile ownership really is. We guard our collections, we trust routines, but sometimes someone slips through the cracks, not with violence but with care. Earl Summers didn't want to take. He wanted to preserve. But in doing so, he crossed a quiet line between stewardship and theft. And like Le Passant in Paris, he left behind only questions. How do we measure loss when something is taken not for profit, but for safekeeping? In the months that followed Earl Summers' quiet confession, Fenton, Missouri settled uneasily back into its suburban rhythm. Mail was delivered. Collections were reorganized. The Fenton Stamp Club resumed monthly meetings, albeit with less enthusiasm and far more locked cabinets. Yet something lingered, not fear exactly, but the kind of quiet paranoia that comes from realizing someone had been inside your world without you ever knowing it. Inspector Gene Rutherford remained in town longer than expected. Though the case was technically closed, the deeper implications unsettled him. He couldn't stop thinking about Earl's final words. "I didn't take them, I saved them." What does it mean to save what isn't yours? And why did the Phantom return some stamps but not others? Inside the cabinet, Rutherford requested a deeper inventory of Earl's basement binders before they were officially returned or archived. He brought in a local postal historian and 2 members of the USPS inspectorate with expertise in philatelic crimes, a niche so obscure that only 5 people in the country specialized in it. They laid out the binders on folding tables in the municipal courthouse basement. Binder by binder, page by page, they discovered 38 stamps listed as missing by private collectors. 61 stamps technically never reported stolen, but known to have disappeared from postal safes or outgoing mail. 3 that had been given away as gifts years earlier but were now in Earl, recovered, not attributed file. 11 stamps that hadn't been missed at all. The last group was the most disturbing. They were high-value collectors' stamps, rare airmails, commemoratives, misprints, but their owners had either not realized they were gone or had never known they possessed them in the first place. Some of these were lifted from ignorance, the postal historian murmured, half in awe. Rutherford understood. Earl hadn't just been taking from collectors, he'd been curating from chaos. The return binder. One binder stood out. It was small, with a faded cloth cover and dog-eared corners. Inside, 33 stamps, each accompanied by a photograph of its original owner's collection, a note on how it had been borrowed, and a date of return. Each entry ended with the same phrase: reintegrated, no resistance noted. This binder was never meant to impress. It was an accounting of reverse theft. The stamps weren't stolen for profit or display. They were taken, evaluated, and sometimes returned, as if the act of taking had been its own form of organization. Is this obsession or ethics? Rutherford asked aloud. No one had an answer. The unsolved mystery of the safe. One detail continued to haunt Rutherford: the Elvis Presley commemorative sheets. They had gone missing from a locked safe, secured behind 2 locked doors in the Fenton post office. There had been no damage, no alarm, and only 3 people had access, none of whom matched Earl's schedule that day. And yet, the sheets were recovered intact from Earl's cabinet. How had he done it? Rutherford confronted Earl during a follow-up interview. Did you copy the key? No. Then how? Earl was silent for a long time. Finally, he said, sometimes safes aren't locked. People think they are, but they're just noisy when you close them. It was a strange answer. But upon rechecking the safe's latch, Rutherford discovered it had a habit of jamming just before the final click. It gave the impression of locking without actually sealing shut. Earl hadn't forced it. He just noticed it. Anomalies in the route logs. Rutherford also examined delivery route logs dating back several years. What he found wasn't criminal, but it was strange. Earl had altered delivery patterns, slightly delivering some houses 5 minutes earlier or circling back hours later. Sometimes, he delivered to houses not currently on his assigned route, justifying it as assisting a colleague. When asked why, he gave no firm answer. But when the homes were plotted against missing stamp cases, an eerie alignment emerged. Earl had been present near every disappearance. And in several cases, he'd made a delivery the day before the theft occurred. Rutherford began to suspect Earl didn't always take items himself. Sometimes he just left a door unlatched, or nudged a drawer open, or observed how often people checked their safes. He wasn't always the hand that took. Sometimes he was merely the conditions. Stamps from the dead. One of the stranger moments in the investigation came when a widow, Mrs. Alois Banning, contacted Rutherford after hearing about Earl's arrest. She had lived 3 houses down from Earl's route and remembered him fondly. After her husband died in 1973, she had packed up his stamp collection in a cedar chest and hadn't touched it since. But just weeks before the news broke, she opened it again. Inside was a note, typed on thin paper. One removed, one returned, now complete. And her husband's favorite stamp, a rare pre-cancellation misprint which had been missing for over 20 years, now rested in its original sleeve. I thought I had just lost it, she said, but now I think he brought it back. Rutherford didn't know what to make of it. Had Earl been keeping this stamp for years? Or had he returned it from someone else's collection entirely? Was this order or madness? The philosophy of possession. In a handwritten page slipped between 2 stamp sleeves, Rutherford found this line: possession is an accident of time, stewardship is a choice. This was how Earl saw his actions. Not as theft, not even as correction, but as guardianship. He had taken what was vulnerable from collections poorly stored, neglected, misfiled, or unappreciated, and brought them to order. And when he felt they were ready to be seen again, he returned them. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was trying to be a librarian. A visit to the Stamp Club. Weeks later, Rutherford attended the Fenton Stamp Club's monthly meeting unofficially, quietly, standing in the back of the local library's multi-purpose room. The mood was different. The crowd smaller. Conversations had lost their warmth. Collectors kept their binders closed, some chained or double-locked. One even refused to open his display pages for fear someone might Earl him. Walter Kinsey, however, spoke. "I don't condone what happened," he said, "but I understand it." He tapped his binder. "I used to think these were mine, but the truth is I'm just holding them. They're stories. They want to move." No one responded, but a few nodded. A letter without a stamp. After Rutherford returned to St. Louis, a plain envelope arrived at the inspectorate office. No return address. No fingerprint. Inside was a single stamp, a 1929 New York airmail known to be missing from a private collection in Texas. With it was a note. Misplaced, not taken, returned when ready. There had been no public record of the Texas case. No news articles, no interviews. Which meant someone still had access to non-public collector inventories. Was Earl operating again? Had someone else picked up the archive? Or had the philosophy spread? Reflection when silence curates. In a world that prizes loud heists, broken alarms, and dramatic escapes, the story of the Fenton Stamp Phantom doesn't fit. There were no guns, no fences, no markets. Just a man with keys he didn't copy, drawers he didn't break, and stamps he didn't sell. His crime was not greed, it was custody without consent. He saw disorder and imposed structure. And in doing so, he made collectors confront an uncomfortable truth. That what we guard most carefully is sometimes more vulnerable to gentleness than violence. And that loss isn't always a rupture. Sometimes it's a reorganization. Quiet, temporary, unseen. By the spring of 1979, the case of the post office phantom had largely disappeared from public view. Earl Summers had completed his court-mandated probation. He'd moved out of Fenton, forwarding no new address. The Postal Service quietly filled his former route with a rotating series of part-timers, and the matter was considered officially, at least resolved. But in truth, it never ended. Inspector Gene Rutherford, now back at his St. Louis office, kept a single drawer for unresolved files that never quite closed. Earl sat at the top, labeled not with a case number but with a nickname. Curation. Whispered returns. Over the following year, subtle incidents were reported across Missouri and southern Illinois. A 1935 commemorative stamp, believed destroyed in a fire, reappeared in its original collector's envelope postmarked, "Returned to sender." A set of Olympic issue stamps, missing from a school library since 1964, was found tucked into the back of a children's history book during recataloging. One collector reported finding a stamp pinned to his office corkboard, with no memory of having put it there. None of the cases involved forced entry. None involved new thefts. But each bore the same signature trait: a quiet return and no expectation of credit. A stamp fair surprise. In 1981, at a regional philatelic fair in Kansas City, a man in his 30s, wearing a gray blazer and nondescript spectacles, visited several booths asking not to buy, but to correct listings. He claimed certain stamps were misdated, others misattributed. He was polite, calm, soft-spoken. He identified himself only as Daniel. Several vendors dismissed him. One, a retired librarian, humored the man and later discovered that Daniel had returned after hours to adjust a misfiled exhibit binder without disturbing any other pages. Security footage was inconclusive. But in the morning, a sticky note was found on the table. "Order matters, thanks for keeping them warm." Rutherford heard about the incident months later through a collector newsletter. He drove to Kansas City himself. By then, Daniel was long gone. The last known binder, the final confirmed item, linked to Earl Summers, arrived in 1983. It was mailed anonymously to the Postal Inspectorate in Chicago. Inside, a softbound binder titled Unrecoverables. The contents: detailed notes on 17 stamps he had intentionally chosen not to return, each listed with a moral justification: carelessness, mistreatment, disregard for history. In one case, he noted, "Owner sold mother's war correspondence stamps for alcohol. Item withdrawn from circulation indefinitely." Rutherford studied every page. The binder was typed on the same typewriter as the previous return notes. The paper had the same watermark, the style unmistakable. But this time there was a final page. Handwritten. "This is the last archive. The rest are gone. I'm tired of borrowing. I hope they learn to look closer." It was unsigned, but the handwriting matched Earl Summers' personnel file from 1975. No further sightings. After 1983, Earl vanished entirely. No tax filings. No driver's license renewal. No voting records. His mother passed in 1985. Her obituary listed no surviving children. Rumors circulated that Earl had moved north and continued his work under another name. That he was institutionalized, misunderstood by a justice system unable to parse ethical theft. One theory suggested he joined a monastery, organizing old scrolls with the same reverence he once showed stamps. Rutherford dismissed none of them, but he also confirmed none. He believed Earl had simply gone quiet, not vanished, but receded, like the faded ink of a rare postal cancellation. The idea that outlived him. Strangely, Earl's philosophy began to spread. Collectors, at first cautiously, began adopting curation codes, documenting every transfer or trade in painstaking detail, logging emotional or historical value alongside monetary worth, returning misidentified stamps to former owners even when not legally required. A few even began leaving notes in their collections. "If found, please preserve with care. It was never truly mine." By the late 1980s, the American Philatelic Society had formed a small committee on curatorial ethics in private collecting, a direct, if uncredited, response to Earl's case. His approach, once viewed as theft, was quietly reframed as an uninvited audit of complacency. A quiet reflection. Inspector Rutherford retired in 1992. He left behind a well-worn briefcase and a single typed letter addressed to the Internal File Division. Not every violation is malicious. Not every thief is selfish. Sometimes, what we call a crime is a question in disguise. Do you still care for what you once loved? Or were you only holding it until someone else remembered how? G. Rutherford, Case File 73CR, the Post Office Phantom. He never spoke publicly of Earl again, but he kept a stamp in his personal wallet until his death, a simple red 2-cent Washington. It was slightly off-center, slightly torn, but carefully protected. Legacy, not a theft but a mirror. The story of Earl Summers remains one of the quietest crimes ever investigated by the United States Postal Inspection Service. There were no vaults broken, no alarms tripped, no stolen goods on the black market. Instead, there was a man with a key to the quietest corners of people's lives. He didn't steal for money. He stole to remind you what you had. And in some strange, unsettling way, he gave it back better than he found it. Story 3. The Forgotten Warehouse Fire of North End, Liverpool. Liverpool, 1963. The city's northern docks stood like a rusted ribcage along the Mersey skeletal outlines of a bygone empire. Ships still came and went, but the golden age of British maritime trade was fading, its great warehouses slowly emptying, their contents less valuable with each passing year. But amid the aging wood, coal dust, and salt air, something strange happened so quietly, it was almost missed. A warehouse fire. No headlines, no bodies. No obvious crime. Just flames and a silence that lasted decades. This is the story of Warehouse 12, a structure built to store cotton and rubber that burned for 6 hours on a quiet November night, and left behind no insurance claim, no criminal report, and no eyewitness willing to testify. Until 1994. The fire that shouldn't have happened. It began on the evening of November 14, 1963. A porter named Alan Worsley, working a late shift at Pier Head, noticed a plume of smoke rising from the north end. He assumed it was a dockworker's stove, common in the colder months. But by 10:37 p.m., the orange glow was visible from the riverfront. When fire crews arrived, flames were already licking the rafters of Warehouse 12, a long-disused building on Bramley Moor Dock. The fire was unusual from the start. There were no stored goods on record. The building had been locked and unpowered for over a year. There was no gas line, no working electricity. And yet the fire raged like a fuel-fed inferno. Crews battled it until dawn. But what they found when the smoke cleared was even stranger than the fire itself. No owner, no origin, no claim. When investigators reviewed the scene, they found no signs of squatters, no bedding, no food waste, no clothing. No ignition source, no candles, stoves, or accelerants were recovered. No recent entries in dock records. The last logged entry for Warehouse 12 was March 1962. Yet the fire burned with a chemical intensity, melting the iron fittings and collapsing a steel loading gantry. The Liverpool Fire Brigade filed it as an unexplained industrial blaze. No arrests were made. What was never publicly revealed, what was quietly buried in a Department of Trade folder was this. No one ever came forward to claim damages. Not the Port Authority. Not the leaseholder. Not the supposed owner listed as West Mercantile Holdings, a shell company dissolved in 1959. It was as if the building didn't exist anymore. The inspector who couldn't let go. Enter David Cray, then a junior fire inspector. Cray was 29, new to the role and meticulous. He kept a separate journal for each case, often far more detailed than the official reports, and Warehouse 12 bothered him. He visited the site repeatedly in the weeks that followed the fire, often alone, sometimes at night. He took photographs, measured scorch patterns, traced the path of melted nails in the stone. He couldn't find a single clue pointing to accidental origin. What he did find, though, was stranger still. In the southeast corner of the warehouse furthest from the reported fire's origin point, he uncovered burned paper remnants, fused into glass fragments. The fragments had letters scorched into them. A Registry A. Not for shipment. Item 38. Officially, no documents were listed as stored on the premises. So why were records burning? A quiet closure. Cray submitted a supplementary report to his superiors, titled Warehouse 12, Unidentified Contents. It was never acknowledged. 6 months later, he was transferred to Building Code Enforcement in Greater Manchester. The case was closed. 3 decades later, In 1994, a redevelopment project sought to revitalize the northern Liverpool docks into public parks and event spaces. During preliminary demolition of the derelict Warehouse 13, adjacent to 12, contractors uncovered something unexpected: a sealed basement corridor, blocked by steel sheeting and bricked from the inside. The path led not under Warehouse 13, but across the property line, to the remains of Warehouse 12. Inside, scorched shelving, twisted filing cabinets, and a fire-damaged safe door. The markings were partially legible. G Registry Discrete Holdings Division, Liverpool EST, 1938. No such registry was known to exist. The return of Cray. Now 60 and long retired, David Cray was contacted by a curious city planner named Lena Hargrave, who'd found his name in a marginalia note inside a scanned copy of the 1963 fire report. She wanted to know if he remembered the case. Cray didn't just remember. He still had the photographs. And more than that, he had a theory. The G Registry. Cray believed Warehouse 12 had served as a de facto vault not for money, but for delicate records, managed off books for clients unwilling to trust traditional banks or state archives. He believed the fire wasn't an accident, but a targeted purge of documents that were no longer safe to keep. Whether they related to tax avoidance, land ownership, smuggling manifests, or wartime contracts, Cray couldn't say. But the consistent detail he focused on was this: every page fragment I recovered mentioned numbers: item 38, Registry A, slot 4F. These were not goods. These were records of goods. A lost ledger. A breakthrough came in the form of a bound shipping ledger, unearthed behind rusted insulation by renovation workers. Though heavily damaged, the surviving pages listed over 90 entries tied to G Registry, Liverpool. Each entry contained a date spanning 1942 to 1957, a coded designation, e.g., Case R blue ink, a note reading, "Do not transfer, hold only," and in a column marked Client, many names were redacted or burned away. But one name repeated: M. Sedgwick. Who was M. Sedgwick? City records revealed little. 1 Miles Sedgwick appeared on a property deed in 1948, listed as an asset auditor for a short-lived import company. No tax records, no birth certificate, no death notice. Yet, among private papers in the Maritime Museum's collection, Hargrave found a letter from a customs official complaining about Mr. Sedgwick's insistence on waiving inspection procedures for bonded goods stored off-register. Sedgwick, it seemed, had operated within the rules but beside them, which made him the perfect kind of ghost. Reflection: a fire meant to forget. The 1963 blaze at Warehouse 12, long ignored, was not just an accident or even a cover-up. It was a reset. A controlled obliteration of records tied to invisible cargo, invisible contracts, and invisible hands. It wasn't just about destroying what was stored. It was about erasing who stored it and why. Cray died in 1999, but his final note to Hargrave read: Warehouse 12 was a museum of secrets. Someone lit the match not out of malice, but because the past had outlived its usefulness. And no one came forward, because no one was supposed to remember. The 1994 discovery of the sealed corridor under Warehouse 12 reopened not only a long, cold fire investigation, but a series of questions that had no official place in city records. Most of the structure had been lost to time and smoke, but what remained: scorched cabinets, melted shelving, and a cryptic ledger hinted at something more than storage. The warehouse hadn't just caught fire. It had been erased. City planner Lena Hargrave, intrigued by both the mystery and the implications for redevelopment plans, dug deeper. With each step, it became clearer. The story of Warehouse 12 wasn't about arson. It was about what was never meant to be found. The Sedgwick pattern. From the rescued ledger, the name M. Sedgwick appeared 19 times, attached to entries spanning nearly 2 decades. The details were always cryptic. Case R blue ink. Item 17 locked documents. Box 2E unstamped. Most entries bore a note. Hold only, not to be listed. Lena Hargrave, trained as an urban planner, was no crime investigator. But her attention to systems roots, flow, paperwork gave her an advantage. She began to map the known entries against historical cargo data from the Mersey docks and Harbor Board archives. To her surprise, nearly all entries coincided with ships from neutral countries, particularly Switzerland and Sweden, during the post-war Reconstruction years. Most bore no customs declarations, but several were linked to Red Cross relief shipments, marked with diplomatic privilege. Why would charitable shipments be tied to secret documentation stored in an unlisted Liverpool warehouse? The Swiss connection. Through a connection at the University of Liverpool, Lena contacted a retired historian, Dr. Ruth Engels, who specialized in Cold War maritime logistics. Engels reviewed the fragments and drew a disturbing connection. These weren't shipments. They were transfers of capital not in money but in documents that represented money, ownership stakes, patent rights, land transfers, maybe even bonds. Engels believed Sedgwick had been a custodian of valuable documentation for individuals or institutions unable or unwilling to store them legally in their home countries. Post-war Europe, she said, was full of people trying to hide wealth from governments, and Britain, while not immune to regulation, had plenty of blind spots if you knew the right people in shipping. A letter to no one. Inside a folder of war-era property assessments, Hargrave found a crumbling envelope, unmarked, likely misplaced in the Maritime Museum archives. It contained a single letter, unsigned but written in formal business English. The documents are no longer viable. The beneficiaries have either expired or refused contact. No entity wishes to be named. The recommendation stands: full destruction under plausible conditions. The date: October 27, 1963. Just 18 days before the fire. Revisiting the fire. Lena filed a public request for access to the original fire brigade logs. It took 3 weeks and a personal appeal to the council's legal department, but she obtained a photocopied transcript of the dispatch records. One line stood out. At 10:18 p.m., a watchman on the South Dock reported a controlled glow inside Warehouse 12, 15 minutes before the official alarm. The watchman later retracted his statement, claiming he was mistaken. But his note was time-stamped. More tellingly, no attempt was made to suppress the fire until it had fully engulfed the structure. Hargrave began to suspect that someone had been present not to prevent the fire, but to make sure it consumed everything necessary. Unofficial channels. She reached out again to former Inspector David Cray, now nearing 60 and in fragile health. He invited her to his home in Wigan, where he had kept a modest file of what he called untied knots. Among them were photographs taken the morning after the blaze, never submitted to the official report. One showed a half-melted metal tag nailed to a charred beam. The tag read, 13B, Restricted Archive S. 1939, Geneva-Liverpool Division. The Geneva reference confirmed what Engels had suggested. But Cray had more. He handed her a manila envelope with a single line typed on the front. The signatures were always missing. Inside were copies of burned document fragments, what little could be recovered after the fire. The one trait they all shared: no documents were signed. Many had typed names, official-looking headers and transaction language, but no visible signatories. That suggested either they were never executed, or that they were intended to remain deniable. The missing audit. Cray also pointed Lena to an obscure paper trail from 1954, an interagency dispute between the Treasury Solicitor's Office and the Port Authority about an unfiled inventory list. According to the memo, an attempt was made to inspect Holdings Vault 12, but was blocked by legal representatives citing non-disclosure agreements and shipping immunity clauses. The audit was canceled, and no further attempts were made. The implications were chilling. Even in peacetime, parts of Liverpool's port system remained legally untouchable, shielded by overlapping jurisdictions and wartime-era exceptions. Warehouse 12 wasn't just forgotten. It had been built to be forgotten. The second fire. 2 months after Lena's discoveries went public, during a historical panel on maritime secrecy, another strange event occurred. A small fire broke out in the back room of the old Customs House storage facility, where several decommissioned ledgers and scanned archives were kept awaiting digitization. It was quickly extinguished. Damage was minimal, but among the burned items, a series of old dock plans, including early revisions for Warehouse 12's expansion in 1950. Investigators ruled it an accident, but Hargrave couldn't ignore the timing. Reflection: paper trails burn faster than buildings. By the end of 1995, Lena Hargrave had compiled her findings into a private research file titled Registry of the Vanished, a case study in design disappearance. She never published it, not because of pressure or fear, but because she realized the case didn't end at redefined what a crime could be. Warehouse 12 was not burglarized. No one was murdered. No money visibly changed hands. And yet something immense had vanished. Not just evidence, but the idea that we can ever truly know what institutions choose to forget. The fire was not the crime. The fire was the final page turn of a book no one was supposed to read. And whoever struck the match left behind just enough ash to make us wonder. What did we store, and why did we decide it was safer to let it burn? The deeper Lena Hargrave traveled into the remnants of Warehouse 12, the more she came to believe that what had burned in 1963 was not just a building or a stack of old documents, it was a mechanism. A structure deliberately constructed to hold and then release a very specific kind of information. But unlike museums or libraries, this one was designed with no visitors, no displays, and most critically, no permanence. The safe that had melted in the discovered sublevel had no lock on the inside. The bolts were decorative, the latch rigged to suggest resistance, but ineffective. It hadn't been built to secure anything from thieves. It had been built to give the impression of security. A symbolic vault. And someone, sometime in late 1963, had decided its illusion had lived long enough. A final discovery. In 1996, as part of a private redevelopment archive, Lena received a scanned shipment log from a warehouse in Leith, Scotland. It was a stray item sent in error, likely from a clerical merge, but it contained a familiar name. Sedgwick M. In 1956, he had authorized the movement of Container 47R from Edinburgh to Liverpool by road freight. Its listed contents: archival contents, fragile. Non-manifest, do not open in transit. Destination: G Registry Discrete Holdings, W12 Liverpool. This was the only official paper linking Sedgwick directly to Warehouse 12. And it proved that at least some of its contents had come from outside Liverpool, perhaps part of a larger network. Lena followed the lead to Edinburgh but found no surviving records of Container 47R. The road freight company had folded in the 1970s. The driver's logs had long been discarded. But the destination was undeniable. The name that was. Whoever Sedgwick was, he had left very little behind. No known photographs, no letters, no descendants. Even his supposed title, asset auditor, was unverifiable. Lena speculated that Sedgwick wasn't a person at all. He may have been a title or a rotating pseudonym shared among those responsible for what Cray once called invisible inventory. She consulted a linguist who specialized in post-war intelligence ciphers. He proposed that M. Sedgwick might not be a name but an internal code. M equals movement. Sedgwick equals internal slang for secondary logistics, based on a defunct colonial depot name. Whether true or not, it reinforced the pattern. Warehouse 12 was never designed for the public eye. It was a ghost space, monitored by ghost names. And in the end, it had been ghosted by its own caretakers. Inspector Cray's final letter. Before his passing in 1999, David Cray mailed Lena one final package delayed by months due to a misplaced return address. Inside was a faded photograph, taken in 1964, the ruins of Warehouse 12 just before demolition. At the bottom of the photo, in Cray's own handwriting, he had written, "You never find the center of a maze like this. You just find places where someone else turned back." And below it, the fire was never about destruction. It was about obligation. They kept those records because they had to. Then they burned them because they could. That's the only story that matters. A pattern across the docks. After Cray's death, Lena began to hear whispers from other cities. A similar fire in Belfast, 1952, no ownership claims, unknown cargo. A lost manifest case in Marseille, 1965, building demolished, no official cause. In Hamburg, a dock explosion in 1970 had reportedly destroyed old diplomatic archives, held in a warehouse never listed on any registry. Each case shared three traits. A building used for passive storage. No legal claim filed after destruction. No press coverage beyond basic fire damage. She began compiling them into a private dossier, dubbed The Vanishing Warehouses. She wasn't sure if they were connected, but she suspected the truth. The ethics of erasure. Was the fire a crime? There had been no charges, no complaint, no theft. Just smoke, silence, and a line drawn under what had once been inconvenient knowledge. Lena concluded that Warehouse 12 had not been robbed. It had simply outlived its usefulness, not to its owners, but to its silence. What it stored were not artifacts, but decisions, land leases, offshore accounts, invisible investments, post-war detours, and asset routing. Paper records whose danger came not from their contents, but from their reappearance. And when the people behind those papers died, or lost power, or changed allegiance, the documents were permitted to disappear. The new warehouse. In 2002, during the last phase of redevelopment along Bramley Moor Dock, a new warehouse was constructed near the site of 12. It was modern, all steel and glass, with offices and retail below. During a site tour, Lena noticed a bronze plaque mounted discreetly near the corner. In memory of the dock workers who kept this port moving, seen and unseen. Dedicated 2001 by the Liverpool Free Trade Preservation Society. She asked the site manager who had funded the plaque. He didn't know. It came with the design package, he said. Architects insisted it be placed near the east wall. That was the exact location of the fire's point of origin in 1963. Reflection, a crime by design. The fire that consumed Warehouse 12 did not destroy something evil or even illegal. It destroyed something complicated, something no longer wanted, but too dangerous to simply hand over. It was a crime of timing, not violence, a moment when accountability had aged out, and someone realized that the safest lock was flame. No fingerprints, no insurance, no survivors, just ash, and the subtle understanding among certain corners of power that some records are born to die. Story 4. The librarian who altered time forged books at Cambridge. Cambridge, England, 2006. A routine conservation audit at one of the university's smaller, lesser-known libraries, Pembroke College's old reading room, revealed an anomaly so subtle it took months to fully understand. A graduate student working under a grant from the British Library had flagged a book in the rare holdings catalog for preservation, a 1679 printing of Pliny's Natural History, supposedly part of the college's original donation from the 18th century. But upon opening it, she noticed something wrong. Not with the ink or the paper or even the Latin. It was the page numbering. It was perfect. Too perfect. A discovery in the margins. The student, Naomi Griggs, had a background in conservation science. She knew that early printed books, even those done by the best printers, exhibited small irregularities, misplaced headers, uneven spacing, faint pressings from worn type. No 17th century book looked factory-made. But this one did. Curious, she ran a basic spectroscopic test on the ink. The iron gall composition was accurate well within historical parameters, but the fiber content in the paper wasn't. It tested positive for chemical bleaching agents not invented until the 1940s. At first, her supervisor assumed it was a mix-up. But as they checked further titles, more anomalies surfaced. Books long thought to be 17th and 18th century originals turned out to be impeccable forgeries, not recent, but still post-World War II. They weren't mass-produced fakes. They were one-to-one copies, meticulously replicated, right down to the leather bindings and mold stains. Someone hadn't faked a few books. They had replaced originals quietly, carefully over decades. Enter archivist Malcolm Rowan. For nearly 40 years, Malcolm Rowan had served as assistant archivist and librarian in various Cambridge collections. He was never particularly well known. He published no major research, rarely attended conferences, but among archivists he was known as infallibly precise, almost monastic in routine, unfailingly polite, and almost pathologically withdrawn. He retired in 2004, just 2 years before Naomi Griggs uncovered the forgeries. When investigators reviewed the sign-out logs and conservation requests over the previous decades, Rowan's name appeared again and again, often requesting books for routine cleaning, rebinding, or moisture checks. Books that would later test as modern fabrications. The impossible originals. At first, the assumption was theft. Rowan must have sold the originals and replaced them with forgeries to cover his tracks. But nothing ever turned up for sale. Not on the black market, not in private auctions, not even in the quiet world of shadow library dealers. Instead, something stranger surfaced. Several books Rowan had flagged as forgeries during his career were discovered to be authentic, but not authentic to the claimed century. Instead, they bore characteristics from earlier editions, including marginalia, bindings, and even misprints that should not exist in the version cataloged. In one case, a 1691 legal text held in the Trinity Archive contained marginal annotations in a style dated to 1650, 40 years before the edition was published. This didn't make the book a fake. It made it an anomaly, a historical contradiction. The row of rewrites. An internal investigation led by Cambridge's Rare Book and Manuscript Library uncovered 34 suspected forgeries across 4 colleges. They shared these characteristics: paper aged to match originals, period-accurate binding glue, corrected pagination that mirrored later editions, ink formulas consistent with 20th-century forgeries, subtle alterations in prefaces and footnotes, referencing ideas not in circulation at the time of original publication. It became clear these were not fakes designed to deceive for money. They were corrections, as if someone had gone through history and quietly fixed its errors one book at a time. The signature hidden in time. Forensic examiners brought in from the British Library eventually discovered something buried deep within the bindings of a 1723 botanical atlas, a folded slip of paper sewn into the spine bearing a simple note. It read, "This version is closer to what the author meant. Errors multiply when trusted too long. Mr." The handwriting matched samples of Malcolm Rowan's staff records. It wasn't a denial. It was a confession, but not to theft, to curation, the ethics of quiet alteration. Rowan was still alive, living alone in a cottage near Ely, teaching part-time Latin to local grammar school students. When confronted by investigators, he was calm. He neither denied nor defended his actions. He only asked, "Do you believe the first edition is always the truest?" Then, after a pause, "History prefers clarity. I gave it some." Rowan was never arrested. Technically, he had not profited. The books had never left the collections, and many had in fact been improved, structurally stronger, better preserved, with corrected references and more accurate footnotes. The question now wasn't what he'd done. It was why. A lifelong pattern. Records from as early as 1973 showed that Rowan had been annotating catalog cards, marking inconsistencies in publication histories that most librarians overlooked. Duplicate page counts, missing errata slips, incorrect author attributions, titles assigned to the wrong publishers. Over time, he had quietly begun to request repairs, then rebindings, then verification printings. He worked with a trusted private press in Sussex, long since shuttered, whose records showed periodic orders for historic layout tests and page reproduction proofs. But they never printed books in full. Someone else had assembled them. Reflection, a librarian's quiet reign. Malcolm Rowan altered 30-plus rare books over nearly 40 years. Not for fame, not for wealth, but out of an obsession with historical correction. To him, errors left uncorrected became truths. Footnotes misattributed shaped arguments. Typos survived long enough to mislead dissertations. So he corrected them. But he never published his work, never told his colleagues. He simply replaced the world's mistakes with quiet versions of what should have been. When word of the altered rare book spread quietly through Cambridge's archival circles, the reaction was mixed. Some saw Malcolm Rowan as a quiet perfectionist, no more culpable than a museum conservator restoring a fraying canvas. Others viewed him as a philosophical vandal. He hadn't destroyed the past, they argued he'd rewritten it, and not through essays or scholarship, but through invisible substitutions, paper for paper, page for page. His edits looked like history itself. But behind the ethics debate, one question persisted. Where were the originals? Because to forge a flawless replica, you must first study the source. And if Rowan had replaced these books, he must have stored the real ones somewhere. A hidden trail of preservation. In early 2007, an assistant librarian named Edward Broom, sorting through the attic storage of the Pembroke Archive, stumbled upon an unmarked wooden crate. Inside, 3 volumes, each wrapped in cotton sleeves, bound in noticeably older leather than the ones found in the public archive. When examined, they matched, page for page, the supposed forgeries Rowan had submitted decades earlier for conservation. Except these versions had irregular pagination, water stains, uneven margins. They were the true originals. But they had been hidden away, not destroyed. And on the inside cover of each, in Rowan's small, precise handwriting, was a note. Retained for reference, not ideal but authentic. The second collection. Broome reported the discovery to the college's archival council, who authorized a quiet, off-the-record audit of deep storage spaces in Pembroke and Clare College, two libraries, where Rowan had worked most extensively. The team expected to find maybe a half-dozen swapped books tucked away, misfiled. What they found was an entire hidden collection. Inside a climate-controlled sub-basement beneath the Pembroke West Wing, long believed to house decommissioned furniture, were 11 wooden shelves, shielded behind a false wall. Each shelf contained books wrapped in wax paper and marked with coded labels. And every label began with the same prefix. Mr. R.F. Malcolm Rowan reference file. These weren't fakes. These were the displaced originals. A personal index. Each book bore an index card, clipped to the front cover, with notations in Rowan's own hand. Loose thread binding, corrected in replica. Preface mentions second edition moved back one printing. Typo on pg 198 referenced erroneously in 1956 treatise. These were not acts of deception. They were acts of corrective obsession. Rowan hadn't just forged books, he'd made them better. And then he had kept the flawed originals out of sight, but never out of mind. He didn't burn them. He cataloged them. Interview under lamplight. Investigators, stunned by the basement find, requested a second interview with Rowan, now 74, living in quiet semi-retirement and still tutoring Latin. He agreed without hesitation. In the reading room of a small private library near Ely, he sipped tea and listened calmly as questions were asked. Why, they asked. Rowan smiled faintly. Because permanence is a dangerous lie. He explained that as a young librarian in the 1960s, he'd encountered a misstated manuscript cited in dozens of academic texts. No one questioned it. It had become canon. That one typo traveled across 5 generations of scholarship. He had no power to revise the academic record, but he could change the object itself. And so, he began replacing the erroneous with the corrected. One book at a time. The mistake, if small, becomes the truth. I simply offered the truth a chance to catch up. Ethics or intention? The university declined to press charges. Rowan had taken nothing, sold nothing, destroyed nothing. He had even preserved the originals, an act that spared him legal action. But within Cambridge's rare books community, fierce debate took root. Was he a criminal, a misguided idealist, or a rogue archivist who understood the fragility of memory better than anyone? Some argued that his corrections created a false reality, one where later scholars might trust an altered version, thinking it untouched. Others said he had exposed how uncritically we treat originals. Because Rowan hadn't rewritten history. He had shown how easy it was to rewrite, and how few would notice. The personal copy. In 2008, a new librarian at Clare College found a small package left behind in a drawer of the senior archivist's desk. No name, no note. Inside was a modern reproduction of the Anatomy of Melancholy, 1651 edition. But the marginalia wasn't modern. It was hand-copied, in ink-matching 17th-century composition, down to the acidic staining and feathered strokes. And on the final page, one line was written in Latin. He who forgets is not innocent, he is an accomplice. Imdar. The writing matched Rowan. The book was donated to the college's special collection, with the caveat that it never be catalogued as either fake or original. It would remain unresolved. Reflection, the archive that breathed. Malcolm Rowan altered over 40 known rare books. He replaced originals not with counterfeits, but with corrected echoes versions that looked like the past, but whispered the future. He didn't erase history. He edited it, one italicized footnote at a time. He built a second archive beneath the first, a shadow copy where mistakes were forgiven, and truth was quietly nudged closer to the surface. And when asked if he regretted it, Rowan only said, "Books don't speak, but they remember what we let them say." By the time the full extent of Malcolm Rowan's quiet rewriting came to light in 2009, Cambridge had begun to shift its approach to rare collections. What had once been a stable hierarchy of editions, provenance chains, and binding records was now viewed through a more anxious lens, one where even the most carefully preserved volumes might contain intentional alterations that had gone unnoticed for decades. Rowan never spoke publicly again. He passed away in 2011 at the age of 78. His funeral was sparsely attended. A few former colleagues, 2 distant nieces, and a pair of archivists who sat in silence and took no notes. No official eulogy was given. But 3 weeks later, a single book was found left outside the university's main archival doors. Bound in faded leather, with no external markings. Inside on the title page, it read, "Correcting Memory, Notes on a Lifetime of Gentle Intrusions." Imlar. A posthumous ledger. The book contained 123 handwritten entries, organized like a ledger, each entry documented. The original title and edition Rowan had altered. A precise description of the changes he made. The reason for each change, be it historical inaccuracy, logical inconsistency, or confusion due to misprints. And finally, the location of the original copy, hidden or archived under a coded label. Some entries were minimal. Corrected misprint in Act IV, Scene Roman 3 Hamlet. One word, but it changes the rhythm. Others were more elaborate. Restored footnote suppressed by 1742 political censor. Cross-verified in Dutch edition. Left corrected version on open shelf. Original moved to box 3H under R. Rowan had done what no librarian was supposed to do. He'd taken the passive act of preservation and turned it into an active pursuit of clarity. The Hidden Room. In 2012, during scheduled renovations to the undercroft beneath Pembroke College's West Wing, workers uncovered a sealed room previously marked as mechanical storage. Inside was a modest desk, a battered reading lamp, and 4 floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Each shelf was carefully cataloged, with hand-labeled tags matching entries from Rowan's posthumous ledger. Some books bore visible repairs. Others were annotated in fine script with correction notes like, "Accepted modern attribution to wrong author. See E.R. Swain 1891. A ledger on the desk listed each book, date of reconsideration, the day Rowan had completed a full comparative study and decided the version was flawed enough to correct. He never called them fakes. He called them adjusted survivals. Academic response. The release of Rowan's ledger sent ripples through the rare book and archival communities. Most institutions chose to classify his modifications under a new internal term, Rowan revisions. These were defined not as forgeries, but as intentional, informed replacements made without profit or malice and, crucially, without informing catalog authorities. The debate that followed was fierce. Were Rowan revisions legitimate conservation? Or were they violations of bibliographic trust? Some academics called them a quiet crime. Others a gentle rebellion. One scholar wrote, "Rowan did not destroy the past. He created a shadow archive, one truer to his mind, but not to history's unfolding." The case of the impossible reference. A striking example of Rowan's work emerged in 2015, when a doctoral candidate cited a passage from a 1710 sermon held in the Trinity College archives. The student referenced a footnote about foreign education policies that scholars believed didn't exist until the 1740s. The candidate was accused of misattribution until Rowan's ledger revealed. Inserted updated footnote in 1710, sermon found uncited in marginalia from a later 1763 printing. Original idea predates known publication. In effect, Rowan had taken a credible but overlooked idea and inserted it backward into the historical record. It was a footnote that should have existed but hadn't. Until he put it there. The puzzle of the missing originals. Despite finding over 60 hidden originals in his coded storage spaces, a significant number of volumes listed in Rowan's ledger were never recovered. Not because they were destroyed, but because they were donated. In a series of anonymous transfers, dating back to the 1980s, Rowan had mailed or gifted books to obscure rural libraries, foreign archives, and even private collectors, carefully disguising them as unsolicited donations. One such copy, a 1699 travelogue altered by Rowan, was found in a university in Estonia, catalogued under a slightly incorrect title. Inside was a note. Authentic but unhelpful, send elsewhere when ready, Mr. It was as though Rowan believed the book should move, like stories told around a fire, not be locked in vaults. The catalogue that blinked. One of the strangest consequences of Rowan's work was the cataloging feedback loop. Because his alterations were so precise, some modified books had been digitally scanned and used in online databases as definitive editions, which meant later scholars cited them as primary sources. Even after Rowan's ledger came to light, multiple versions of the same book coexisted, all appearing authentic. The question became philosophical. When does correction become authorship? And if a librarian can reshape how we understand a text without ever adding their name to the page, what else might we be reading that's already been rewritten? The Last Book. In 2016, a final Rowan book surfaced in an envelope delivered to the Cambridge University archives. It was the Book of Hours, an illuminated devotional from the late 1400s. Rowan's version was not forged, it was real, but repaired with painstakingly matched medieval parchment, stitched in the style of the original and re-illuminated by hand. Inside the front cover, this line was written in Latin. What endures must be reshaped to survive. Below it, this is my last revision. Mr. The handwriting was older, more fragile. It matched samples from just before his retirement. A reflection on time, not theft. What Malcolm Rowan did was not the work of a con artist. It was the lifelong labor of someone who couldn't bear to see mistakes ossified into truth. He didn't want to own the past. He wanted it to breathe better. His crime, if one can call it that, was believing too deeply in history's ability to change, and then quietly showing that it already had. Lotion Bottle Story 5, The Counterfeit Perfume Ring of Southern France. Grasse, France, 1992. Nestled between the Alps and the Mediterranean coast, Grasse had been the heart of France's perfume industry for over 3 centuries. The air itself seemed to shimmer with scent fields of jasmine, rose, and tuberose stretching over hillsides like carpets of fragrance. It was a place where artistry and chemistry met in vials the size of thimbles, and where a single drop of oil could be worth hundreds of euros. But beneath this fragrant surface, something else was brewing. Something off-note. It began with a perfume that was too perfect. The first whispers. Perfumer Elodie Varnier, one of Grasse's most respected noses, first noticed the anomaly in late spring. She had received a sample of a scent from a private buyer, purportedly a vintage extract from 1956, bottled under a now-defunct boutique house called Parfum Lumière. The bottle was antique, the label correctly yellowed, the wax seal brittle. Everything suggested authenticity. Until Elodie smelled it. The top note, a rare Tunisian narrowly, was too bright. The mid-note, a violet accord, didn't fade properly. And the dry down, it lacked the faint animalic musk that defined the era. To most, it would have seemed like a treasure. To Elodie, it felt like a memory that had been edited. She didn't report it. Not yet. But she began to ask questions. A market of shadows. Grass had always had a quiet undercurrent of black market fragrance, illicit jasmine harvests, stolen formulas, synthetic oil swaps. But in the early 90s, a surge of vintage perfumes began circulating through private collectors, antique fairs, and online mailing lists. They came with certificates. They smelled correct nearly. And they fetched extraordinary prices. Yet when lab-tested, many revealed chemical signatures invented in the 1970s or later, molecules too stable, aldehydes too pure. Someone wasn't just duplicating perfume. They were recreating memory, molecule by molecule. And no one could prove who was doing it. Inspector Benoit Lemarchand. In late 1992, Grass's municipal police received an anonymous tip about false perfume provenance being sold under a respected antiques dealer's license. The case was referred to Benoit Lemarchand, a quiet man with a background in chemical forensics and years spent investigating agricultural fraud. He was methodical, slow-moving, but known for catching details others overlooked. He began with records. Dozens of boutique bottles had changed hands over the previous year, mostly in private transactions, with handwritten receipts and no official invoicing. Many were traced back to the same vendor. La Maison de Brooms, a picturesque shop on Rue des Orangers, known for rare scent collectibles and vintage atomizers. The shop that sold the past. La Maison de Brooms was run by a woman named Colette Blanc, 58, a former fragrance archivist for a now-defunct perfume lab. She was polite, elegant, and famously discreet. Her clientele included celebrities, historians, and a few anonymous names known only by courier. When Lemarchand visited the shop posing as a buyer, he was offered a 1929 extrait Vérité Noire, an obscure fragrance once favored by Parisian courtesans. The scent was intoxicating. But the label had a detail wrong, a comma missing between noir and parfum, a printer's quirk not seen in bottles until a 1971 reissue. When Lemarchand returned with his credentials, Colette didn't deny anything. She only smiled and said, "People don't want the truth, they want the truth they remember." The silent chemist. Further investigation revealed that Colette had been receiving shipments oils, tinctures, alcohol bases from a small lab registered under the name Elan Vert, located just outside the city. Officially, Elan Vert produced herbal distillates for soaps and essential oils. But its founder, Maurice Arden, had once studied organic synthesis at the Sorbonne and held a minor patent for stabilizing volatile aldehydes. When questioned, Arden was evasive. He claimed he only provided materials, not finished perfumes. But in his lab, Lemarchand found dozens of trace sample bottles, each labeled with vintage perfume names, and each one chemically modernized to mimic historical decay. It wasn't illegal, but it wasn't innocent. The ring emerges. Lemarchand's growing file revealed a subtle but coordinated network. Colette sourced empty vintage bottles from auctions and collectors. Arden reproduced historical scents based on surviving formulas or analytical reconstructions. The two paired them, aged the packaging, and sold them to eager collectors looking to recapture a forgotten scent. Certificates of provenance were forged using outdated paper and antique typewriters. Most shocking, they never sold more than one bottle of each scent. No mass production. No bulk shipments. Just one perfect lie at a time. A perfume that was. The case hit a turning point when Le Marchand uncovered a bottle of Rose de Minuit, supposedly a lost fragrance from 1931. It had never appeared in any catalog, nor was it listed in known fragrance encyclopedias. Yet the bottle was perfect, the scent mesmerizing. When tested, it contained a molecule IFF aldehyde 51, first synthesized in 1968. Le Marchand confronted Arden. Arden finally admitted, "That one we invented from scratch." A homage to a perfume that could have existed. They had not only faked the past, they had invented a better version of it. Reflection, the memory in a bottle. Le Marchand prepared a report. He documented the sourcing, the chemistry, the fraud. But he struggled to file charges. No consumer had complained. No money had been stolen. The scents were real, just not true. And when he asked the collector why she had paid 12,000 francs for a clearly modern recreation, she answered, "Because it reminded me of my mother, and I choose to believe." The case was quietly archived. Elan Vert ceased operations the following year. La Maison de Brooms closed its doors in 1995. But even today, collectors whisper about a perfume so convincing, so hauntingly familiar, it could only have been made by someone who understood. A scent doesn't need to be real, it just needs to be remembered. Inspector Benoit Le Marchand didn't forget the scent. Months after he'd boxed up the case notes, sealed the exhibits, and moved on to tax fraud in nearby Nice, a memory still lingered. It was that first breath of Rose de Minuit, the invented perfume Arden claimed never existed in history, only in memory. The scent would rise in his mind at odd times, climbing stairs, reading an old book, or passing by a florist's shop. It wasn't just that it was good, it was haunting, as if it were echoing something he should have known but had forgotten. He had shelved the case as non-prosecutable, but he hadn't let it go. And neither, it turned out, had others. The Whisper Network. In early 1994, Le Marchand received a letter unsigned, handwritten on ivory paper. It read, "I purchased a bottle of Jardin de Lune from Rue des Orangers in 1993. I've worn it since. Last week, someone told me it never existed. Am I mad, or is the world lying?" And it was the first of 6 letters he would receive that spring, all written by collectors, archivists, or former clients of Colette Blanc, all expressing some version of the same confusion. A scent they remembered had disappeared from official records. A bottle they owned wasn't found in any archive or brand registry. They had worn, loved, even gifted perfumes that, by all appearances, had never been made. And yet they existed. Not mass-produced, not sold at scale, but found, one by one, in perfect form. The archivist from Versailles. Le Marchand drove to Versailles to meet one of the letter writers in person, Camille Prieur, a perfume archivist at a private scent museum. She was soft-spoken, skeptical, and deeply familiar with the history of perfumery. When he asked about her letter, she showed him a bottle labeled L'Armes de Clémence, dated 1942. Camille said she had worn it for years after purchasing it from Colette in 1991. It reminded her of her grandmother's wardrobe. But when she tried to source a refill, she hit a dead end. It's not in Osmotek, not in Firmenish's vaults. The formula doesn't appear in any house catalog, French, Italian, or otherwise. No chemist I've spoken to can identify some of the molecules. Le Marchand asked if she thought it was a fraud. She held up the bottle and smiled. "I think it's a gift. A perfume from a reality that didn't make it. Someone gave it a home here. The formula that shouldn't work. Curious, Lemarchand brought the bottle to a friend in Lyon, Dr. Pierre Manet, an independent olfactory chemist who specialized in historical reconstruction. Dr. Manet ran a full GCMS analysis. The results were baffling. Several base molecules matched known historical materials. Others were structurally modern, but stabilized in a way not typical of commercial perfume chemistry. The musk backbone was a synthetic variation not registered in the EU until 1997. When Lemarchand pointed that out, Manet replied, "That molecule is rare. It would be illegal to use in volume. But if someone had synthesized it privately, they could build something entirely new and pass it off as old." Arden's silence. By mid-1994, Elan Vert was a shell paper only. Maurice Arden had vanished. His name was no longer associated with any lab. When Lemarchand tracked down his last known address near Mougins, the house had been sold, and the new tenants had never heard of him. A neighbor recalled seeing delivery vans once or twice a week in the early 90s, but after that, nothing. Lemarchand sent a request to customs for lab-grade fragrance material imports, tied to Arden's old licensing code. Only one flagged. A single international shipment from a supplier in Japan. Contents: 24 glass vials, labeled only by number. Declared purpose: experimental aromatic evaluation. He was working on something bespoke. Something outside the industry's rules. The collector's salon. The deeper Lemarchand looked, the more it became clear. Colette and Arden hadn't just recreated perfumes. They'd created a parallel canon. He discovered at least 21 separate fragrances. Some modeled after forgotten prototypes. Others subtly tweaked classics, changing just one accord. And some completely original. Each was sold only once. Each recipient believed they had found something lost, not something new. In 1995, a small group of collectors held an invite-only salon in Lyon. They displayed their bottles like relics. A few sprayed the air with notes of ghostly vetiver, fatting lilac, powdery iris. Lemarchand attended undercover. One guest said, "There are only two kinds of perfume worth owning. The ones you remember, and the ones no one else does." The legal gray. From a judicial perspective, there was no fraud. Buyers were not misled in contracts. No public health violations were documented. The products were chemically sound. Yet within the perfume world, this practice was now known as spectral perfumery, the fabrication of plausible historical scents not grounded in official records. The term emerged in an article by scent historian Jacques Vellier, who concluded, "The work is criminal only to archivists. To wearers, it is a kind of time travel." The community was split. Traditional houses viewed it as heresy. Collectors, they saw it as reverence. An unexpected archive. In 1997, Camille Prieur, now head of her museum's curation wing, was notified that an anonymous donor had gifted a locked trunk to her collection. Inside, 24 bottles carefully labeled, many matching known, phantom, perfumes from Colette and Arden's era. Attached was a handwritten note, unsigned. "For those who can't forget what never was." She cataloged them, but chose not to display them publicly. She placed them in a temperature-controlled vault, labeling them simply, "The Lost Line." Today, they remain uncited in any public perfume literature. But private tours are occasionally given to those who know the right questions. Reflection: the scent you swear existed. By the time Lemarchand finally closed the last file in 1998, he had stopped calling the case counterfeit. Instead, he labeled it cultural fabrication, Olfactory archive. Colette and Arden had committed no legal crime, but they had altered memory. They proved that scent ephemeral, emotional, and fragile could be planted in the past like a fossil, that a perfume, if built precisely enough, could rewrite nostalgia. In the end, Lemarchand wrote one sentence in the margin of his report. They didn't sell perfume. They sold what people wanted to believe they once smelled. By 2001, the town of Grasse had returned to what it always was: quiet, perfumed, and steeped in a tradition that stretched back to the 17th century. The scandal surrounding La Maison de Brooms had mostly faded, tucked into perfumery circles as a whispered legend. The case of the ghost scents, the perfumes that never were. Yet for Inspector Benoit Lemarchand, the case refused to dissolve. He had closed it, but it had not let him go. Every once in a while, a fragment of something scented, barely there, would drift up from the past like a forgotten song. That's how it felt when he received a package in spring 2002, postmarked from Geneva. There was no return address. Inside, a single unlabeled bottle. Colorless, elegant, heavy glass, vintage cap. And a note in simple cursive. The final one. Please treat it as memory, not evidence. The trial that never was. Despite Lemarchand's extensive documentation, neither Colette Blanc nor Maurice Arden had ever been formally charged with a crime. The materials were real. The scents were chemically safe. And no buyer had stepped forward to accuse them of deception. The prosecutors quietly categorized the case as intellectual manipulation, not criminal fraud. It fell into a void of legality where art, chemistry, and psychology overlapped in a way no law had been designed to handle. There had been talk of a civil lawsuit from a historic fragrance house, claiming brand dilution over a ghost scent too similar to one of their lost classics. But once their in-house perfumers smelled the recreated perfume, they declined to proceed. "It's better than what we had," one of them reportedly said. "Let it die beautifully." The collector's market. The story of the spectral perfumes spread slowly but steadily through private collector circles. By 2005, rumors of a secret catalog listing all the known ghost scents circulated on online fragrance forums and early email groups. It supposedly included bottle descriptions and label anomalies, known locations of extant bottles, speculative formulas based on chromatography. It was called the Phantom Index. No confirmed copy of it has ever surfaced, but entries have been quoted in closed forums with haunting accuracy. One such excerpt, attributed to the index. 11. Serment d'Or Soft Chyper Base, Ghost Rose, Cardamom Top. Sold only once in 1991 to a blind writer from Turin. Lemarchand recognized the case instantly. He had interviewed that writer. The man swore he remembered what the color red smelled like because of that perfume. The disappearance of Colette Blanc. In 1995, just months after her shop closed, Colette disappeared from all professional records. She withdrew from the perfumery associations. Her name no longer appeared in industry publications. A death certificate was never issued. Some say she moved to Morocco. Others claim she went blind and lived out her days in a convent in Avignon. But one former apprentice, who remained anonymous, told a journalist in 2003, "Colette used to say perfume was the only way to preserve emotion without distortion. Not memory, emotion. And once she saw how powerful that was, she didn't want it to be used for anything else." In that way, her disappearance was the final note in a scent meant never to be worn too long. Maurice Arden, the last formula. Arden was never seen again publicly after 1994. But in 2006, a notebook believed to be his was found in an abandoned storage unit near Marseille. It contained sketches chemical structures of modified aldehydes and musk chains, along with poetic labels like Une rue dans la pluie, Ravel de Verre, Minuit Courbet. Each entry detailed synthetic profiles designed to age like memory, to lose potency not through decay, but through design. Arden had engineered fragrance entropy. He'd built perfumes that would change, shift, fade not because of poor chemistry, but because scent was, to him, a temporal medium. On the last page he had written, "The future will forget the original. Let the copy do what memory cannot. Remain beautiful." Lemarchand's final act. The unlabeled bottle from Geneva stayed on Lemarchand's shelf for 3 months before he uncorked it. He was retired by then. He lived alone in a quiet cottage, surrounded by pine and rock rose. When he finally opened it, the scent rose slowly like mist warming in early sun. A hint of bergamot, powdery iris, a touch of dusty lilac softened by age. It was familiar, not in name but in effect. It reminded him of something, not a person or place or time, but of longing, the kind you can't quite locate. He wore it once to a small dinner party, where a woman leaned in gently and asked, "Pardon, what fragrance is that?" "It smells like the first time I saw Paris." Lemarchand smiled and said nothing. Reflection, perfume as a crime of care. In the end, the counterfeit perfume ring of southern France did not trade in profit, harm, or vanity. It traded in the impossible, the smell of a garden that never existed, the perfume your mother might have worn had she chosen differently, a scent that lingers in the air long after memory has let it go. Colette and Arden were not criminals in the usual sense. They were historians of a parallel timeline. And like all good historians of emotion, they understood. A scent cannot lie, but it can tell the story you wish had happened. Story 6. The Watchmaker's Crime: Stolen Time in Vienna. Vienna, Austria, 1987. The clock shop on Wiedner Hauptstrasse was barely noticeable among the Art Nouveau facades and student cafes of Vienna's 4th district. Tucked between a stationery store and a modest tea room, it had no signage, only a golden gear-shaped motif engraved on the door. Inside, rows of pocket watches and mantel clocks ticked quietly, some with rhythmic confidence, others with hesitant, arthritic movements. The shop's owner was a man no one quite knew, but all remembered. His name was Otto Krell. He spoke rarely. He smiled politely. And for nearly 20 years, he repaired timepieces so precisely that many said he could make a clock run backward, not literally, of course, but in the way it seemed to restore the past. What no one knew, what no one even guessed, was that Otto Krell had once stolen time. Literally. And that crime would not come to light until an audit found missing minutes. The curious case of 18 missing watches. It began, as many strange stories do, with a government registry. In the spring of 1987, the Austrian Cultural Heritage Office performed a routine audit of items on loan to private conservators, pieces held for cleaning, repair, or temporary storage. Among them were several antique watches from the Hofburg Treasury, 17th and 18th century pieces attributed to royal horologists. When the audit cross-referenced conservator receipts and logs, something odd emerged. 18 watches, all once part of the Habsburg archives, had been signed out for repair but never returned. The paperwork bore Krell's signature, but Krell insisted gently that he had returned all items within the allotted time. The receipts told another story. Each return form was dated. Each bore his meticulous handwriting. And none of the watches were present in either the shop or the archives. They had vanished. A watch that shouldn't exist. 3 months later, a collector from Salzburg attended an antiques auction in Prague. There, he purchased a Baroque pocket watch for a significant sum. It was in pristine condition, featuring an ornate repoussé scene of the goddess Minerva flanked by two lions. The collector, a retired horology professor named Dr. Thomas Weiss, instantly recognized it not just for its craftsmanship, but for the serial engraving. 720-11-83 property of the Habsburg treasury. He knew because he had cataloged it himself in 1975. It was supposed to be in Vienna, but the movement had been overhauled. The balance wheel updated. The escapement adjusted to an accuracy unheard of in 18th-century mechanics. Someone had not only taken the watch, they had perfected it. Inspector Renata Muhlbach. The Austrian Federal Police assigned the case to Inspector Renata Muhlbach, a detail-oriented investigator known for her quiet persistence and deep respect for cultural crimes. She reviewed the audit findings and paid a visit to Otto Krell's clock shop. It was pristine. Every gear, every spring, every cog labeled and shelved in glass cases like rare insects. Krell, now in his 60s, greeted her with a quiet nod. He did not deny having worked on the watches. He offered records, handwritten notes, sketches, even chemical cleaning logs. But when asked why the watches hadn't been returned, he simply replied, "I did return them. Time sometimes slips between people." The watchmaker's past. Born in 1928, Otto Krell had trained under his uncle in Graz before moving to Vienna in the 1950s. He had no criminal record, no family, no known enemies. But Renata found one oddity. In 1963, Krell had been denied official membership in the Austrian Horology Guild. Reason: excessive restoration beyond historical integrity. Krell had a reputation for making antique clocks too accurate, upgrading mechanisms, refining tolerances, even rebalancing oscillators to modern standards. Historians saw it as a violation of temporal authenticity. Krell saw it as an act of care. Why should a clock be wrong simply because it is old? He once wrote in a letter to the guild. A second watch appears. Another collector, this time in Geneva, contacted Muhlbach after reading a short notice in a horology journal. He had purchased a timepiece at a Berlin flea market unsigned, but bearing hallmarks consistent with the 1730s. Inside the case, engraved in tiny letters, "Property of the Imperial Collection. Serial match 728-184. Also listed as missing. The movement modified. The balance spring modern alloy. The tick precise to within plus or minus 2 seconds per day." This was no amateur's work. It bore the hand of a man who didn't just fix time. He rewrote it. The unofficial archive. Muhlbach obtained a warrant to search Krell's shop. There was no trace of the stolen watches. But tucked behind a false panel in a drawer, she found a ledger leather-bound, dense, and written in the same hand that had signed the repair receipts. Inside, each entry described a watch's original flaws, mechanical inconsistencies, rust, drift. A breakdown of modifications, gear replacements, recoil adjustments, chronometer-grade escapements. And most strangely, a reflection short personal notes about each timepiece's character. One read: 721-183 resistant to change, loud tick, wants to be heard, modified but not silenced. Another, 728-180 for misaligned intention, corrected, breathe smoothly now. Muhlbach wasn't sure what disturbed her more. That the man was stealing and modifying priceless artifacts, or that he spoke of them as if they were alive. A matter of time. Experts debated whether Krell's actions constituted theft. Legally, the watches had been on loan for repair, not to be altered or withheld. But there were no signs of resale for profit. No bank transfers, no hidden wealth. The modified watches had been dispersed quietly, often to small collectors or lesser-known dealers. And each had been improved. Accuracy boosted. Mechanics stabilized. Value increased. But their historical soul gone. Reflection, the weight of restoration. When finally interviewed under formal caution, Krell was composed. He did not deny the modifications. He only asked one question. Is it a crime to make timepieces do what they were built to do? Muhlbach replied, "It is if the history is what we are preserving." To which Krell responded, "Then perhaps you are not preserving time. You are freezing it." His license was revoked. The remaining watches, those that could be traced, were seized and placed into deep archival storage. None have been publicly displayed, but some say that one still sits in Muhlbach's office, ticking steadily, impossibly accurate for its age. She claims it's there for evidence, but every so often she glances at it not for the time, but for remembrance. By the autumn of 1987, Inspector Renata Muhlbach had assembled a small task force dedicated to one of the strangest cultural crimes in recent Austrian history: the illegal modification and dispersion of historically significant watches by master horologist Otto Krell. What made the investigation so difficult and so intriguing was the nature of the offense. Krell had not destroyed the watches. He had not even technically stolen them in the traditional sense. He had taken them, modified them, and let them escape. No ransom, no sale to black market dealers, no forgery. What he had done was something altogether different. He had altered time's relics. And Muhlbach was determined to understand why. A third watch resurfaces. Through quiet outreach to international auction houses, Muhlbach's team located a third watch believed to be from the missing Hofburg set. This one was unusual, not because of the craftsmanship, though that was remarkable, but because of its signature. Engraved on the inner lid, a tiny symbol, 3 concentric circles interlinked like gears. Not part of the original maker's mark. Not part of any known horological registry. A personal glyph, perhaps. When cross-referenced with a sketchbook from Krell's workbench, seized during the shop search, the same 3-gear motif appeared in the margins. Sometimes next to a date. Sometimes next to a small drawing of a clock face missing its hands. Muhlbach was struck by one particular sketch, a clock floating in water, dissolving. Beneath it, Krell had written in precise script, "Some clocks do not tell time. They tell the feeling of time." A visit to the Horology Guild. Seeking more clarity on Krell's background, Muhlbach arranged a meeting with the Austrian Horology Guild, the same organization that had denied Krell membership in 1963. The president, Erich Feldman, recalled Krell with a mixture of reverence and unease. He was a purist's nightmare. He didn't restore watches, he reimagined them. Feldman described how Krell had once presented a late 18th century French pocket watch that had been corrected to, within modern quartz accuracy, something almost physically impossible, without violating the original movement's mechanics. But Krell had done it without digital intervention. Pure gears, pure balance. When told he had desecrated history, he reportedly said, "The original maker would have done this if he'd had the means." A new angle, the philosopher of time. One of Muhlbach's researchers, Anna Krupke, found a long-forgotten article from a 1972 horological journal. It was a guest essay, penned anonymously, titled, "The Ethics of Precision in Historical Instruments." The piece argued that restoring a clock to its flawed original state was not preservation, it was idolatry. That historical accuracy should not mean mechanical inferiority, and that artisans of the past would have welcomed technological advancement had they lived to see it. Anna compared the phrasing to Krell's notebooks. A linguistic expert later confirmed with 89% probability. Krell wrote the article. He wasn't just modifying old watches. He was expressing a philosophy. What makes a crime? Muhlbach faced an impossible prosecutorial challenge. The state wanted to preserve heritage. But Krell's actions had technically improved the physical function of the artifacts. He hadn't destroyed the watches. He had returned some. Others had gone missing only due to bureaucratic misfiling and private sales. And no collector, once contacted, wanted to give them up. They described the watches in poetic terms. It breathes. It calms me. I never knew time could sound like this. One collector, a composer from Krakow, claimed the tick of his Krell-modified watch had inspired an entire movement of orchestral work. Another, a widow in Graz, said she set the watch beside her bed each night because it made her feel like her husband was still keeping time for her. What Krell had done, legally murky as it was, had caused no harm. But the state couldn't ignore the symbolic violation. So the debate began. Was enhancing the past the same as destroying it? Krell's journal, The Sentient Clock. Among the shop materials seized in the investigation was a handwritten manuscript, nearly 100 pages long, titled simply, The Sentient Clock. Part essay, part memoir, it blended philosophy with practical horology. A few of the more notable passages. A clock does not know the time. It creates it just as a song creates silence by giving it structure. We preserve the rust of age because we fear change, but age itself is not sacred. Function is. When I repair a watch, I do not bring it back to life. I bring time back to the object. And this particularly haunting line. I have never owned a watch of my own, only the time I borrowed from others. Muhlbach read the journal 3 times. Each time, she closed it feeling less like she was chasing a thief, and more like she was studying a priest of lost time. The sound of the tick. It was a junior officer who finally noticed the anomaly. He had been reviewing audio logs from surveillance conducted at Krell's shop before the raid. The goal had been to determine whether illegal transactions were taking place. The tapes contained hours of silence, soft movements, drawers sliding. But the officer noticed something strange. The sound of the clocks ticking in the background was unusually consistent despite being dozens of different models and types. When processed through audio analysis, the waveforms of nearly all the clocks shared the same cadence, the same pulse. Krell had not just repaired the clocks. He had synchronized them. Even across centuries, manufacturers and mechanisms. He had made them all beat together. The museum refuses the pieces. In 1990, the Austrian National Museum offered to place Krell's modified watches on display as part of a controversial exhibition. Time Rewritten, The Horological Heretic. But the board of curators declined. Their reasoning: the watches were no longer representative of the eras they claimed. They had become hybrids between historical artifact and modern machine. A compromise was reached. One piece 720-1183 would be placed in storage, and another, untouched, displayed side by side for academic contrast. But when the exhibition launched, curiously, the modified watch was absent. Unofficially, it was said that one curator had taken it home, unable to resist the tick that felt like a heartbeat. Reflection: the cost of precision. By 1993, Otto Krell had quietly relocated to Innsbruck, living under a modest stipend arranged through legal mediation, part restitution, part pension. He was not imprisoned. He was not honored. He simply disappeared. When Muhlbach was later asked by a journalist if she regretted not pushing for harsher penalties, she replied, "You can't imprison a man for loving time too much. You can only ask him to love it less visibly. The last known quote attributed to Krell came from a private letter to a watchmaker's apprentice. When you fix a clock, listen first. It will tell you how it wants to be remembered. The case of Otto Krell might have ended quietly, like the fatting tick of a watch left too long on the shelf. But time, like stories, rarely rests where it's placed. Years later, fragments began to reappear, not of Krell himself, but of his legacy. His crime wasn't theft in the traditional sense. It was restoration taken too far, a devotion to precision that blurred the line between honoring history and rewriting it. Inspector Renata Muhlbach had put the investigation to rest in 1990, but as Vienna moved forward, echoes of Krell's work continued to resurface, sometimes in the most unexpected places. The Lucerne Incident. In 1998, a Swiss horologist named Felix Baumgartner, unrelated to the famous skydiver, was conducting research on 18th-century escapement design. He visited a private estate in Lucerne to examine an heirloom timepiece rumored to have once belonged to Empress Maria Theresa. What he found astonished him. The movement had been entirely modified, its original verge escapement replaced with an early lever system that would not have existed for another 30 years. The timekeeping was flawless, the craftsmanship unmistakable. But more importantly, inside the case was a now familiar glyph. 3 interlocking circles. Krell's work. The watch had never been part of the Hofburg audit list. It had never been documented in any registry. Which begged a question. How many timepieces had Krell touched that no one ever knew about? The apprentice who never was. In early 2001, a graduate student from the University of Vienna, Leonie Draxler, began compiling oral histories of Austrian watchmakers as part of her doctoral thesis on post-war craftsmanship. While interviewing an elderly horologist in Innsbruck, she was told an odd story. There was a man who trained under Otto Krell, quiet boy. Hands like silk, eyes like a microscope. Never smiled, but clocks loved him. No official apprenticeship records for Krell existed, not since his rejection by the Horology Guild in the 1960s. Yet over the course of her interviews, Leonie found 3 different craftsmen, all in different regions, who claimed to have either trained under Krell or learned from someone who did. It appeared Krell had passed on his methods quietly, informally. An invisible lineage. Not a school of restoration. A philosophy of time. The Timekeeper's Letter. In 2003, Muhlbach, now nearing retirement, received a handwritten letter with no return address. It read, "Dear Inspector, I hope time has been kind to you. I've thought often of our conversations, not the formal ones, those were legal necessities. I mean the quiet ones, the ones when you glanced at the clocks without realizing it. You asked once if I regretted altering history. I never answered. My answer is yes, but not for the reason you think. I regret that history is only remembered when it is imperfect. We don't preserve clocks because they work. We preserve them because they fail beautifully. I made them silent, I made them precise. I took away their struggle. And in doing so, perhaps I also took away their soul. But know this, I meant no harm. I only wanted to give them peace. Yours in the silence between seconds." Okay. There was no follow-up. No return address ever matched. But Muhlbach framed the letter and placed it beside one of the only Krell-modified pieces left in state possession, a French carriage clock, repaired to near-molecular precision. It ticked so softly, you had to lean in to hear it. The auction blackout. In 2006, an anonymous collector attempted to list a Krell-modified watch for public auction at Christie's London. The piece had been verified, documented and photographed. But just days before bidding opened, The lot was pulled reportedly due to pressure from an unnamed cultural preservation entity in Austria. This sparked a minor scandal in collector forums. Some believed the Austrian government had blacklisted all Krell-modified works from sale. Others claimed the watches carried legal complications akin to art forgeries, valuable, but morally, and possibly legally, problematic. Still others, more dramatically, claimed that Krell's watches could no longer be owned. They had become too accurate, too personal. Wearing one feels like stealing someone's heartbeat, one collector posted. Muhlbach's private experiment. In her final years as an inspector, Muhlbach made one last quiet experiment. She selected two watches of similar origin, both Austrian, both early 19th century. One had been restored by a traditional guild-certified watchmaker. The other, believed to have passed through Krell's hands, had been quietly reacquired through an academic contact. She placed both watches on her desk. She wound them simultaneously. And then she listened. The guild-restored watch ticked confidently, mechanically like a soldier marching. The Krell piece ticked softly, subtly like a breath, not louder or faster. Just more human. That was the word that came to her. Human. Not perfect, but somehow closer. Closer to what? She never could say. The quiet consequence. To this day, none of the recovered watches are on public display. Some are housed in deep museum archives, accessible only to researchers under supervision. Others are rumored to have found their way into private libraries and clock museums in Eastern Europe and East Asia, where Krell's legend continues quietly whispered among horologists as both a cautionary tale and a quiet inspiration. He broke no law in the traditional sense, but he disturbed the past. He made the old newer than it should have been. And perhaps in doing so, he made us question why we preserve it all. Is it to remember, even if what we remember was broken? Or is it to restore what should have been, had history allowed? Reflection, the morality of accuracy. Krell's story challenges an uncomfortable idea that perfection, in the hands of a craftsman, can be a kind of violence against time. He made clocks better. He made them whole. And yet in doing so, he erased the imperfections that made them historic. But maybe, just maybe, he also helped us listen. To the tick. To the pause. To the silence between seconds. And in that space, perhaps we find the real truth. That time isn't what passes. Time is what remains. Story 7. The Chessboard Poisoner of Turin. Turin, Italy, 2004. The chess club was quiet, as it always was at dusk. Sunlight filtered in through leaded windows, casting geometric shadows across the worn parquet floor. The only sounds were the soft scrape of chair legs, the occasional click of a pawn, and the rhythmic tapping of a quartz wall clock. In the center of the room, a game had just ended. White checkmate. Black slumped forward, unmoving. At first it was thought to be fatigue or a stroke, but within minutes murmurs grew. A hand shook. Someone screamed. The man at the table, a former bishop of the Italian Episcopal Church turned avid chess enthusiast, had died mid-game. He was the first, but not the last. Within the span of 9 months, 5 more deaths followed, each one occurring during a chess match, each one during a tournament or club game, each one suspiciously similar. Mild sweating, blurred vision, confusion, followed by rapid cardiovascular collapse. All victims were male, all over the age of 55. All had played white, and all had lost. A peculiar pattern. When the third death occurred, this time at a regional championship in Florence, authorities began to investigate. But it wasn't until the fourth case that Interpol took notice and classified the incidents as potentially linked. A forensic pathologist from Milan, Dr. Alessia Bortone, noted an unusual toxicological pattern in all 4 victims. Traces of muscarine, a naturally occurring toxin found in certain species of wild mushrooms. Minute levels of bradycardia-inducing alkaloids, likely extracted from plants such as foxglove or monkshood. No digestive tract evidence suggesting ingestion. The cause: transdermal exposure likely absorbed through the fingertips. But from what? The answer came, curiously, from an unlikely clue. The victims had all reported tingling or numbness in their fingertips before collapsing. The common element: each had played on wooden stand-and chess sets, lacquered to a soft shine. The pieces, it seemed, had been tampered with. The Turin Chess Club. Inspector Giulio Farnese, a quiet and patient man from the Turin Carabinieri, was assigned to the lead case after the 6th death, an insurance lawyer found dead during a semi-final game at the Turin Open Chess League. The chess club had become infamous by then, its halls growing quieter, its matches more sparsely attended. Many believed the killer would strike again, and perhaps already had. Farnese, a lifelong lover of logic puzzles and chess enthusiast himself, found the symmetry of the crimes unsettling. Each murder was a kind of checkmate. Each victim had sat across from an opponent who emerged unscathed. And each board bore a strange chemical fingerprint, faint traces of resin, combined with non-lethal but metabolically active botanical toxins. This wasn't sloppy work. This was refined poisoning. A poisoner's game. Farnese began his investigation with a simple question: who touches the chess pieces before the match begins? In most tournaments, boards are set up in advance by volunteers or junior club members. Pieces are wiped down, arranged, polished. But at the Turin Club, the same individual had taken on that responsibility for nearly a decade. His name was Marco Vital. Soft-spoken, balding, in his 60s, a retired civil engineer. He had never placed above 4th in any tournament. Never played aggressively. He was known for one particular habit: always choosing black when given the option. He said it gave him more time to think. Farnese requested an interview. Marco Vital. Their conversation was cordial, even pleasant. Vital offered espresso, explained his love for the game, and seemed genuinely saddened by the recent deaths. He admitted to arranging the boards, said it was his way of giving back. His hands, Farnese noticed, trembled slightly, not from fear but age. But there was something strange. When asked about the victims, Vital recalled each with exacting clarity, not just their names, but opening moves, favorite defenses, even casual remarks they'd made before games. One had complimented his cologne. Another had complained about the draft in the room. Another, he noted, had been overconfident in their queen, gambit. This level of detail was unnerving. Most players didn't remember their own matches that well. Farnese pressed further. Vital smiled gently. I study the people more than the pieces. Pieces move predictably, people don't. A flawed queen. The turning point came not from a breakthrough in toxicology, but from a chessboard itself. A hobbyist woodworker in Genoa had purchased a Stanton set at an estate sale. The previous owner had died of a sudden cardiac event, following a regional tournament. When polishing the queen piece, the man noticed a thin line beneath the crown, barely perceptible. He pried it open. Inside was a thin capsule, lodged inside the hollow cavity of the wooden queen. Lab analysis revealed a blend of alkaloids consistent with slow-acting cardiac glycosides, poisonous to humans in concentrated form, but incredibly difficult to detect without targeted testing. The implication was clear. The capsule had been placed inside a white queen. The toxin, designed to leach slowly through skin contact. The victims had touched the poison pieces repeatedly over the course of hours. Each victim had been playing white. Further testing revealed that 3 other pieces in the same set 2 pawns, and a bishop also contained microdoses. Vidal had designed his poison like a chess strategy. Distributed, subtle, untraceable. Until now. Why white? The most chilling question to Farnese remained unresolved. Why did all the victims play white? Vidal was not among the top contenders in most tournaments. He never won. His games were unremarkable. But when investigators examined archived match data, a pattern emerged. Vidal had played against 4 of the 6 victims within the month before their deaths, albeit in separate matches, different clubs, even different cities. He'd always played black. He'd always lost. The poisoned boards, it seemed, were arranged before his games and left behind afterward. Each new opponent unwittingly inherited the contaminated pieces. Vidal was not trying to kill his direct opponents. He was setting traps, like mines across the chessboard, waiting for others to fall into them. The catalyst. Through interviews with Vidal's former teammates and club members, Farnese slowly pieced together the likely catalyst for his crimes. In 1997, Vidal's wife, Chiara, had died suddenly during a local tournament in Bologna. She had collapsed while watching one of Vidal's games. The cause: an undiagnosed heart condition. According to club records, Vidal had been playing white. He lost the game reportedly in 18 moves. The opponent: Bishop Francesco d'Avila, the first man to die 7 years later at the Turin Chess Club. It appeared the crime spree may have started as a revenge plot. But it hadn't stopped there. Vidal's pathology had evolved. From retaliation to ritual. Closing thoughts. As Farnese reviewed the full scope of the investigation, a disturbing image emerged, not just of a man grieving, but of a man restructuring grief into a game. One that only he could play. One in which justice, satisfaction, and symmetry could be arranged like knights and pawns. Vidal was arrested in April 2005. The final board he arranged was dismantled piece by piece. Inside the black rook, police found a note folded tightly, etched with a fountain pen. "I play second because I always move first. But in the end, it is white who must fall." The arrest of Marco Vidal shook Italy's intellectual circles. It wasn't just that he had poisoned 6 people across a decade using handcrafted chess pieces. It was how carefully, how intellectually he had orchestrated his murders. His motives remained murky, his methods sophisticated, and his demeanor in custody calm, even courteous. Inspector Giulio Farnese likened Vidal to the game he so loved. You couldn't read him. He let you believe you were in control until the board said otherwise. But the case was far from over. The prosecutors needed airtight evidence. The chess community demanded answers, and Farnese himself had a gnawing suspicion. Was the game really over? The quiet interrogation. In an interview room deep within Turin's judicial precinct, Vidal sat under soft lighting, his fingers interlaced. His glasses were folded neatly on the table. Farnese took a seat opposite him. "You used chess pieces as delivery devices," he said plainly. "Laced with contact-based alkaloids, untraceable unless specifically tested for. You knew exactly how much would kill slowly without detection." Vidal gave a small nod, not an admission, but not a denial. "You played black," Farnese continued. "Every time, you chose to lose knowing the pieces would be reused by others, and your targets always playing white." Vidal finally looked up. "There is a moment," he said, "when a losing position teaches more than a winning one. Those men, they never learned anything." A catalog of the dead. The forensic team compiled a full list of Stanton sets Vidal had handled. Out of 37 tournament-quality boards, 6 tested positive for chemical tampering. All had been cleaned, with a proprietary oil blend Vital claimed to use for maintenance. In reality, it was a carrier medium for the toxin. The victims: Bishop Francesco Davila, former church official turned chess player. Dr. Renato Melli, cardiologist, died in Florence mid-match. Fabio Leone, retired banker, collapsed after a weekend league game. Giuseppe Carlini, insurance adjuster, passed out at a semifinal round. Luca Bellini, university professor, found dead at his home board. Aldo Traversi, real estate developer, poisoned in Rome during a club exhibition. Each victim had played white. Each had used a set previously touched or prepared by Vital. But most chillingly, 3 more sets remained unaccounted for. The Apprentice. During the investigation, authorities received a tip from a small chess club in Modena. A local teenager had reported seeing an old man giving private lessons to a friend, an elderly man who resembled Vital. The friend in question, Pietro Santini, was a reclusive 22-year-old with a history of psychological evaluations and a criminal record for animal cruelty. When questioned, Santini was evasive, but a search of his apartment yielded 2 hand-carved Stanton-style sets, a copy of Modern Chess Openings, annotated with notes in Vital's handwriting, a sealed envelope containing a queen piece packed with microcapsules of aconitine, a toxin derived from monkshood. Pietro Santini had never competed in a tournament, but he had been taught by someone who did. Whether Vital had intended for Santini to carry on his crimes, or whether Santini was simply a disturbed admirer, remained unclear. What was certain, the method had already begun to propagate. The trial. Vital was formally charged with 6 counts of murder, as well as conspiracy to commit further acts of poisoning. The prosecution leaned heavily on forensic evidence, including the chemical signatures of the toxins found within the chess pieces and archival footage of Vital handling the boards. But their most compelling weapon was Vital's own words. In a series of letters addressed to his deceased wife, retrieved from a hidden compartment in his home office, Vital had written extensively about cleansing the game, punishing arrogance, and restoring balance through sacrifice. One passage read, "In chess, a queen can dominate, but only the humble pawns move forward. I have no interest in glory, only in justice." Defense attorneys argued diminished capacity, citing grief, advanced age, and obsession. But the prosecution countered that grief had not clouded Vital's mind, it had sharpened it into a weapon. After a 3-week trial, he was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life imprisonment. The final match. Before his incarceration, Vital made a final request. 1 game against Inspector Farnese, no spectators. Farnese, reluctant at first, agreed. The board was set under the supervision of prison officials. Each piece was inspected, swabbed, and cleared. Vital, as always, chose black. The game lasted 47 moves. It ended in a draw. Vital smiled. See, not every game must end in a win or a loss. Farnese collected the notation sheet afterward. He still keeps it, framed in his study next to the queen piece from the poison set that started the investigation. It reminds him that intellect can be twisted, and that evil, when cloaked in civility, is perhaps the most dangerous kind. A pattern emerges. Following Vital's imprisonment, Interpol and Europol began quietly examining similar incidents throughout Europe. A chess match in Lyon where a player collapsed. A timed blitz game in Budapest where a competitor began hallucinating. A private game in Zagreb that ended in cardiac arrest. In each case, the pieces were never tested, the matches low profile, The deaths attributed to stress or pre-existing conditions. But the signs were there. The method had leaked. Vital had started something more enduring than a killing spree. He had created a template. And like all good strategies, it could be replicated. Reflection, when logic turns lethal. Chess is the ultimate symbol of control, of intellect over instinct, of rules governing possibility. Vital subverted that. He turned a sanctuary of the mind into a quiet battleground of mortality. He chose the game's most beloved symbols, kings, queens, knights, not to honor them, but to weaponize them. Why? Grief, ego, a desire to balance some perceived injustice. Maybe all of the above. Or maybe, as he hinted in court, he simply believed that. Some victories are earned not by outplaying your opponent, but by becoming the board itself. And so the chessboard remains. Cleaned, polished, sanitized. But somewhere, in a dusty corner of a forgotten club, a rook still waits.